I was checking the radiator in the room. Everyone said my wife had died in when I saw the wrong green glass beside the bed. Not broken, not ugly, not even wrong enough that another man would have stopped with his hand on the iron valve and felt his stomach turn half an inch cold. Just the wrong glass. The same shade at a glance, the same old-fashioned green, the same bedside decency of water left out for the night. But not Evelyn's. Not the one with the little trapped bubble in the base that caught light like a flaw you learned to love, because it proved a thing had been made by hand and not pressed out by a machine. I stood there a moment in the blue room with the hiss of the radiator under my fingers and the winter light laying itself pale and flat across the coverlet, and I had the strange immediate feeling that the house had just corrected me. I turned the valve a little more and listened to the pipe answer somewhere in the wall. The house I have lived in for 39 years is a white clapboard 2-story on a corner lot in Worthington, Ohio, with black shutters. Evelyn always said were too stern for a house that had raised children. A long front porch that catches every west wind in January and narrow back windows that look onto a garden gone mostly to bare stalks by Christmas, except for the boxwoods and the rose canes that refuse to admit the season. It is not a grand house, though people have called it handsome. It is a house that remembers where things belong. The front hall remembers boots lined against the wall after snow. The kitchen remembers steam clouding the panes over the sink. The stair treads remember the particular complaint of teenage feet. If a spoon rests where it should not, or a lamp cord falls on the wrong side of a table, I feel it the way some men feel weather in an old injury. This is not because I am fussy by nature. It is because for most of my life Evelyn knew where the life of the house was supposed to settle, and after she died, the only way I found to keep moving through the rooms without losing my balance altogether was to keep her order intact where I could. Not perfectly. She would have been annoyed by sainthood. But well enough. By the third Christmas without her, I had become very good at mistaking ritual for peace. I reached for the glass on the bedside table and held it up to the window. Green light moved through it and left a watery shape on the quilt. No bubble in the base, too smooth along the lip. One of the pair from the downstairs cabinet, I thought at first. But no, not even those. Andrea must have bought this one to match the old set, or found it at some antique place with that eye she had for producing a story that looked more expensive than it was. That thought came and went in a second, and then I was ashamed of it. I set the glass back down exactly where it had been and looked around the room. It had been called the Blue Room for so long in this family that nobody remembered when that started. Probably because of the wallpaper pale faded cornflowers on cream put up when our daughter Claire was still in high school and Evelyn had gone through one of her practical romantic phases where she wanted every guest room to look like somebody had chosen it on purpose, and not simply ended up there. The bedspread was a newer one Andrea had brought in after the funeral, quilted white with small stitched medallions that she said brightened the room. There was a framed picture of Evelyn on the dresser, now one I would never have chosen for that room because it had been taken in Florida and showed her wearing sunglasses and laughing into wind. A folded gray shawl lay at the foot of the bed as if she had just stepped into the bath and might come back for it. The room was too arranged. That was the trouble, maybe. Too finished in its grief. I bent and touched the radiator again. Warm now. That room would be comfortable enough tonight for our granddaughter Lucy if Claire and her husband made it down before dark. Or for somebody else if plans changed and beds had to be moved around, which at Christmas they often did. The year Eric was 13, he slept on a pallet under that very window because 3 cousins had the room and no one minded. The year my brother Frank had his hip replaced, Evelyn put him there because the staircase landing was closest, and she said he could manage the extra steps if it meant he would not have to hear the furnace kick all night beneath the master bedroom. I thought of Frank dead now, himself snoring under the blue wallpaper, while Evelyn laughed in the hall with an armful of folded towels. Then I thought of Evelyn in this room, as I had told myself she had been in the end, and the 2 pictures would not lie flat over each other, no matter how I tried to make them. Downstairs, the oven timer gave a soft single bell. I startled like a fool and looked toward the door. The smell that drifted up a moment later was browned butter and rosemary, From the dressing I had par-cooked before noon with underneath it the faint mineral tang of radiator heat and old wood that every winter house seems to breathe once the cold settles in properly. Somewhere farther off from the kitchen probably came the sweet tin smell of the large coffee urn I had already polished for tomorrow morning, because Evelyn believed Christmas coffee should be ready before anyone asked for it. I left the room, pulling the door mostly closed behind me, though not latched. We had not shut it entirely since the funeral. Andrea said it felt kinder that way. That sentence returned to me as I walked down the hall, kinder that way. It is a dangerous thing I have learned too late in life, when one person in a family becomes the keeper of what is kind. At the top of the stairs I paused and put my hand on the banister. The walnut had worn silk smooth over the decades under our palm. Evelyn used to run beeswax over it every November, because she said guests noticed a railing even when they didn't think they did. The little landing window still showed the same side yard, with the split rail fence and the old maple whose branches were bare now except for one paper grocery sack tangled high up from some windy day earlier in the week. Down below the front hall, runner lay straight. My coat hung on the peg nearest the door, a wreath Evelyn had made years ago. Magnolia leaves, fake berries, ribbon too modest to satisfy. Andrea waited on its brass hook. Everything was in place. I came down the stairs slowly, hearing the old house answer me with the familiar complaint in the fourth tread from the bottom. The kitchen was warm enough to make my glasses think about fogging. The windows over the sink had gone pearly with cold on the outside, and the panes carried that wavering late-afternoon winter light that makes everything inside look both homely and exposed. On the butcher block island sat the mixing bowl I had used for the gingerbread earlier, a dust of flour still on one edge where I had missed it with the dishcloth. 2 loaves of challah rested under a linen towel on the counter. The stock pot on the back burner let off a slow aromatic breath of broth, onion, and celery every time the lid shifted. I stood there a moment and let the room settle me. This was the room in which Evelyn had made most of our life visible. Not in speeches, not in the grand sentimental ways younger people sometimes believe marriages are built. In onions, chopped and forgotten, mail stacked, and pies cooling, and arguments ended before bed, because there was a turkey to baste in the morning, and what sense was there in wasting a whole house on resentment? I missed her worst in kitchens and at dusk. I crossed to the sink and rinsed my hands under hot water, though they were not dirty. Through the window I could see the back path leading toward the detached garage, and beyond that, the small shape of the sewing room windows at the rear corner of the house. Curtains open there. I frowned without knowing why. I had opened them that morning to let in what light there was. The room had not been much used since Evelyn died. I kept a lamp in there and the occasional basket of unfolded laundry if I wanted it out of sight before company. Andrea called it the craft room now, though no one in this house had called it that when Evelyn was alive. I dried my hands and turned to the old oak recipe box on the counter. I was not looking for anything important. That is worth saying plainly. Men of my age and stripe are always suspected of having known more than we claim after the fact. We touched the drawer, the ledger, the old envelope, and later everybody says we must have sensed where the truth was leading. I did not. I was looking for the card with Evelyn's overnight dressing measurements because I had mislaid mine and could not remember whether she used 2 eggs or 3 in the mixture when making it ahead. The recipe box smelled faintly of cardstock and nutmeg when I opened it. I thumbed past cranberry mold Parker House, Rolls bourbon glazed date squares. Her handwriting changed over the years, not in character but in force. In the 80s, it leaned forward as if hurrying. In the 90s, it settled into an assured slant. In the last year, when her wrists hurt, the lines grew more careful and upright, as if every letter had to be chosen. I found the dressing card where it belonged, then stopped because tucked behind it was a grocery slip on yellow paper from Jeffers Market, the local one we had used forever, until the chain store drove it under. Her handwriting ran down the margin: celery, sage cream pears, tea biscuits. Check sewing room heat. I read the line again. Check sewing room heat. The room was warm enough when I had opened it that morning. Of course it was. I had turned the little radiator on sometime in November because cold settles hard in the back corner of this house. There was no reason that line should have made me still. No reason at all, except perhaps that I could not immediately remember why she would have written it on a Christmas grocery list if the room was not being used for anything but sewing. The timer on the oven went again sharper this time, and I slid the paper back where I had found it, as if somebody might accuse me of snooping. That was when the front door opened, and Winter came in with voices. Dad Eric's voice, first carrying that same mixture of cheer and apology it had when he was 15 and already late. Then Owen's thinner one behind it. Then Andrea, bright and smooth. "Watch the salt on your boots, sweetheart." "Tom, we're here." I went into the hall before they could get too far in. Eric had one suitcase in each hand, and snow on the shoulders of his coat. He had grown broader through the middle the last 5 years, though his face still kept traces of the serious, narrow-jawed boy he had been. Owen stood beside him, zipped into a red puffer jacket, so puffed he looked almost round-knit cap slipping over one eyebrow. Andrea came in last with a pie carrier and a tote bag that no doubt held half the household. "Merry Christmas," I said. Andrea kissed the air beside my cheek, cool from outdoors and smelling faintly of expensive hand lotion and the cold metal smell of car heat that has just been shut off. "The roads were fine until the exit," she said. "Then some idiot in a pickup decided snow means free will." Eric laughed and set the suitcases down. Owen came to me at once, as he usually did before anyone could direct him otherwise, and I put a hand on the back of his cap and kissed the top of his head through wool. "You get taller just to inconvenience me," I told him. He gave the ghost of a smile. Children had always taken to Evelyn first, and to me later, once they realized I was not strict so much as large and quiet. Owen had been 3 when she died, and still spoke of her, in present tense, sometimes that first year, which nearly broke me every time. By 8, he had learned the family method, which was to put the dead in the past in a tone gentle enough to sound loving. Andrea was already scanning the hall, taking inventory. Boots there, pie to kitchen, coats left not right because the peg was freer. She had a genius for entering a room and behaving as if she were relieving everyone else of burden. Most of the time I had been grateful for it. She saw what needed doing and did it. During Evelyn's illness, when meals came in and appointments multiplied, and I began to lose the sequence of ordinary chores, Andrea had kept lists. She had brought order. That is not a small kindness in a bad season. The trouble, I suppose, is that order gains authority if nobody asks often enough who it serves. "I put you all where you were last year," I said. "You and Eric in the master, Owen in the little room off the hall. Claire and Ben still have theirs if they make it tonight." Andrea gave me the quick, bright smile she used when accepting a decision while improving it in her own mind. "That's perfect. I thought maybe Lucy could use the blue room if Claire gets delayed with the roads, but we'll see." I looked at her. The blue room. She had already bent to unzip Owen's boots. "Well, only if we need it. It seems silly to leave a good bed empty if there's overflow." There was nothing in the sentence to object to. Nothing. Yet I felt again that odd little internal correction I had felt upstairs. "We'll see," I said. Her hands paused just slightly on the boot zipper, then moved again. "Of course." Eric took the pie carrier from her and headed for the kitchen. "Smells incredible in here, Dad." "It smells like the house knows what day it is," I said. "That too." Owen had gotten one boot off and was leaning against my leg for balance while Andrea worked on the second. His body was warm through the red coat. I put a hand lightly on his shoulder and felt him tense under it, not from fear of me, but from something preceding me. He looked up the stairs, then at the front door where Andrea was hanging coats, then back at me. It was so quick I might have missed it if I had not already been unsettled by a green glass. "Need the bathroom, buddy?" I asked. He shook his head. "Then what is it?" He reached up and tugged my sleeve, not hard, just enough to bend me toward him. His breath smelled faintly of peppermint from whatever candy Andrea had given him in the car. His eyes flicked once toward the staircase again. "Grandpa," he whispered so low I barely caught it. "Grandma never died here." For 1 second, the whole hall seemed to empty itself of sound, not literally. I could still hear Eric setting things down in the kitchen. I could hear the furnace start. I could hear Andrea rustling in her coat. But everything I had taken as background moved farther away, as if I had put my head under water. I looked at him. "Why would you say that?" I whispered back, though I do not know whether I meant the question for him or for myself. He shrugged in the small, frightened way children do when they have already gone too far to retrieve a truth. "She didn't," he said. "Mom said Owen Andrea called from the closet. Shoes, honey, not stocking feet in the front hall." He jerked away from me as if the voice had caught him with something hot in his hands. "Nothing," he said louder now, and bolted toward the kitchen holding his loose boot. I straightened slowly. Andrea came back into view carrying the coats. What was that? "He wanted cocoa," I said. "Oh, he always wants cocoa." She smiled, relieved by the familiar. "I'll get him settled." She brushed past me toward the kitchen, one hand briefly on my forearm as she went. Not affectionate. Steering. I stood in the hall with my sleeve still holding the ghost of Owen's grip. You can say a child is mistaken and be done with it. Lord knows families do. The world would not function if every adult stopped to interrogate every sentence spoken by an 8-year-old in a hallway at Christmas time. That is what I told myself. He had heard something. Mixed up rooms. Picked up the old housekeeper gossip children inhale like dust. Any reasonable explanation was available. The trouble was that none of them explained why he had looked at the stairs before he said it. I went into the kitchen because standing still would have made me conspicuous. Andrea was already unpacking, pecans into a bowl, wrapped gifts onto the breakfast bench, a bag of clementines by the fruit stand. Owen at the table with cocoa he had not asked for, but was grateful to receive because it meant safety. Eric had opened the fridge and was peering in with the expression of every adult son I have ever seen in his father's kitchen. Affectionate surprise that food does in fact exist there without female supervision. "Need me to do anything?" he asked. "You can slice the bread when it's cool enough," I said. "Done." Andrea opened the warming drawer and looked in as if she lived here. "Tom, you shouldn't have done so much. It's Christmas. I know, but still." That was another one of her gifts, making your competence sound like evidence of self-neglect. She had arrived just in time to rescue. I took the pie carrier from the counter and set it by the window. Claire call texted. Eric said shutting the fridge. They left later than they planned. Ben had to go back for Lucy's inhaler. They may not get in till after dark. "Fine," I said. "Do you want me to set them in the room now?" Andrea asked. "Which room?" "Their usual. I already put fresh towels there when we came last month. A tiny thing. Tiny. Yet it pricked me. When you came last month to bring the wreaths and help you decorate. I don't recall towels needing put out then." She smiled, not quite puzzled, not quite indulgent. "I just meant I checked the closet and made sure there were enough. Don't mind me. I'm in organizing mode." Eric glanced up, then back at the bread knife. It was such a harmless exchange that to press it would have made me look ungracious. I let it go. That too was a habit with me. We moved through the next hour in the polished way families do when everyone has agreed mostly unconsciously to inhabit the holiday version of themselves. Owen carried napkins from the dining room and dropped two and was not scolded. Eric sliced bread too thick and Andrea made a joke of it. I basted the turkey and set the giblets to cool for gravy and found myself listening against my will for some repeat of what Owen had said. None came. The sun went down early in the blue-white way it does in Ohio winter, with no real sunset to speak of, only a gradual surrender of the windows until the glass turned dark and began giving back the room. I lit the small lamps in the front hall and den. Andrea did the candles on the mantel, though not in the order Evelyn used to place them. She put the taller ones at the ends for symmetry. Evelyn always nested them inward because she said light ought to gather, not perform. That memory struck harder than it should have, perhaps, because it changed the room around me in an instant. One December evening, not her last, but the one before, when we still thought the worst of her breathlessness was weather and overexertion. She had been standing on the hearth rug with a candle in each hand when she had stopped halfway down, shut her eyes and leaned one shoulder against the mantel as if the room had tilted. I had come toward her, and she had opened one eye and smiled before I could frighten myself properly. "Don't make a face like that," she said. "You'll age me. You're winded from candles. I'm winded from carrying your life as well as mine." I took the candles from her and set them down too quickly, wax clacking against wood. "You should have called me." I did. "You were in the garage giving a lecture to a snow shovel." That was Evelyn, able to be dry with one hand while asking for help with the other. I remember guiding her to the armchair by the window, and how light she felt in that one bad minute, not physically light, but as if some ordinary anchor between her and the room had loosened. I remember kneeling to take her slippers off because she said her feet were hot, and her looking down at me with something that was almost apology and almost amusement. "They're all very helpful," she said, then not naming anyone, not needing to. "As long as help means they get to decide." I looked up. What does that mean? Nothing yet. I should have asked again. I know that. But I had spent a marriage learning the art of not forcing clarity before another person was ready to give it, and by the time I came back with water, she was talking about cranberries. That is one of the ways you can lose the truth while telling yourself you are being loving. You honor the detour because it feels gentler than the road. Andrea struck a match at the mantel, and the sulfur smell moved briefly through the room before the candle smoke sweetened. I stood in the doorway and had the unpleasant sensation that the memory I had just had belonged more securely to me than the room itself did. "Tom," Andrea said, "did you want these cards out this year?" She was holding a stack of old Christmas cards tied with ribbon. Evelyn used to save only the ones with actual letters inside and throw the rest away by New Year's. These had been displayed in a silver bowl every December since the funeral, because Andrea said it kept the family visible. "Not the bowl," I said before I had thought it through. Andrea looked up. No. Just put them on the desk in the den." Her eyebrows lifted a fraction. Of course. The fraction mattered because it told me she had expected no preference from me there. None. And perhaps she was right to expect that. For 3 years, I had mostly let the holidays arrange themselves around what other people called helpful. During dinner preparation, the house took on that layered, deeply specific Christmas smell I have never found anywhere outside older family homes in the Midwest. Poultry fat lifting into warm air, orange peel drying near the stove, evergreen needles beginning to heat and release resin by the living room register, wet wool near the back door. And under all of it, the metal pipe smell of radiators doing their patient work. It should have comforted me. It did in part. That was the cruelty of the evening. Everything was itself and not itself. Claire called around 6 to say they were still an hour out. Lucy had fallen asleep in the back seat. Ben was driving carefully. I told her not to hurry. She asked whether Eric and Andrea had made it, whether Owen was excited, whether I needed anything from the pharmacy. There are ways daughters keep loving you after they have moved out, and one of them is through inventory. I told her all was well. After we hung up, I found Owen alone at the dining room window, tracing a small arc in the condensation with one finger. "You planning escape?" I said. He jumped. "No, I hear the roads are no good, so if you are, pick a better night." That won a real smile from him, quick and reluctant. I stepped beside him. Outside the side yard was only a shape. The maple branches looked like charcoal lines against a sky not yet fully dark. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded. "Your cocoa cold?" Another nod. We stood there a moment. Children sometimes talk if you give silence enough room. I had learned that with my own, though not always in time. I waited. At last he said, without looking at me, "Mom said not to talk about upstairs." My chest tightened once hard. "What about upstairs?" He shrugged again. "Just upstairs." Why, I don't know. That was probably true. Children know the pressure in a room long before they know the shape of the thing creating it. What did she say exactly? His finger stopped on the glass. She said, "Don't say things that make Grandpa upset at Christmas." There it was. Not an explanation exactly, but enough to stain the air, and what things would upset me. He looked over his shoulder toward the kitchen. Andrea's voice floated in there with Eric's and the running tap. Owen lowered his voice. "That Grandma didn't—" The clatter of a pan cut across him. Andrea appeared in the doorway, drying her hands. "There you two are," she said brightly. "Owen, come help me find the napkin rings." His whole body changed before my eyes. Not in some dramatic way. He just folded inward a little the way children do when they return to a script. "Okay." As he passed me, he did not look up. Andrea smiled at me. "He's been strange all afternoon. Too much sugar and not enough air. He seems fine. He gets ideas in his head." Her tone was still easy. "You know how he is." No, I thought. I know how children are when they are afraid of naming the wrong room, but I said only, "He's 8. "Yes," she said. "And 8-year-olds love an audience." She went back to the kitchen with him behind her. I stood where I was until the window stopped holding our reflections and gave only blackness. Later, after we had eaten our makeshift first night supper and I had sent Eric out to bring in the rest of the bags and Andrea had gone upstairs to start baths and settle rooms, I found myself at the foot of the staircase listening. This sounds more furtive than it was. I was not pressing my ear to the banister like a fool in a melodrama. I was standing in my own hall with a dish towel over one shoulder because I had just dried the serving bowl and had not yet decided whether to go to the den or the kitchen next. But I heard Andrea's voice above low and distinct. "We don't say that again, sweetheart." A child's murmur I could not catch. "I know, but we don't. It confuses Grandpa, and this is not the time." Another murmur. "No. Upstairs is Grandma's room. That's enough." Then the soft closing of a door. I remained where I was, dish towel in hand, while the old fourth stair gave a little settling creak under nobody's weight. Upstairs is Grandma's room. The sentence should have sounded ordinary. It was, after all, the sentence I myself had lived under for 3 years. Yet hearing it said as instruction said, not as memory, but as management, changed something in me that did not change back. I went into the kitchen and folded the dish towel more carefully than it needed. Eric came in with an armload of gifts and nearly collided with me. "Whoa, you all right?" "Yes, you look pale." "The hall light's bad." He set the gifts down. "Want me to carve the turkey tomorrow? You always butcher it." He grinned, relieved by the old joke. "Then I'll stick to bread." He reached for a beer from the fridge. I watched his face while he opened it. "Eric," I said, "why does Owen think your mother didn't die upstairs?" He blinked once. "Quick." "What, you heard me?" He leaned against the counter, beer half raised, buying himself the time a weak man buys with posture. "He says all kinds of things, Dad. So does everybody. That's not an answer." He stared at the bottleneck. "Andrea told him not to upset you with old details. That's all." "What details?" His shoulders moved. "Just the mess of it. Mom being moved around some at the end. Which room she sat in, which room she slept in when she napped. It was a bad time. You know that. There are moments when a sentence tells you more by what it normalizes than by what it explains. Moved around some at the end, as if one room or another were a matter too trivial to name exactly, as if place were incidental to a life. "I know what a bad time is," I said. "I was here." He winced a little. "That's not what I meant." "Then, what did you mean?" But before he could answer, there were headlights in the front drive, and the crunch of tires over frozen slush, and Claire's horn, 2 short apologetic taps. The moment broke the way family moments often do not, by resolution, but by the arrival of more family. Claire came Irene flurried and cold, Lucy asleep over Ben's shoulder in a blanket all chatter and boots and inhaler bag and wind. For half an hour, the house became exactly what houses like ours become on Christmas Eve. When enough bodies fill them, a machine for receiving warming, feeding, and assigning. Coats multiplied. Ben carried luggage upstairs. Claire kissed my face twice and said the roads were terrible past Dublin. Lucy woke crying because she had not known where she was. Andrea appeared at once with a towel for snow and a voice soft enough to manage everyone into place. That was the polished version of safety, and I entered it with the relief of a man who wanted very badly not to be the sort of father who turns one child's whisper into a holiday crisis. So I helped with bags. I found Lucy's stuffed rabbit. I took Ben's boots to the mat. I accepted Claire's casserole and told her the kitchen was under control. If Andrea gave me an occasional measuring glance, I ignored it. If Owen avoided my eyes, I pretended not to notice. That is how families keep themselves from tipping over, by assigning silence the dignity of maturity. By 10:30, the children were in night clothes, the adults each carrying the fatigue they had earned, and the house had settled into the layered quiet of temporary sleeping arrangements. A toilet flushed upstairs. Somebody laughed softly in the den. The dishwasher gave off its wet soap heat. Through the doorway to the dining room, the tree lights blinked on the old silver and glass Evelyn and I had collected one ornament at a time over 30 years. The whole place glowed. It looked from almost any angle like a house made safe by ritual. I said goodnight earlier than usual because I wanted suddenly and irrationally to walk through the rooms alone. No one objected. Andrea told me not to worry about the breakfast dishes because she would start early. I almost said, "This is my kitchen." Instead, I smiled and went to the back hall. The back hall is narrow with hooks on one side and the door to the sewing room at the far end. In winter, it is the coolest passage on the first floor because the outside wall catches north wind. Evelyn used to keep a braided runner there that her aunt made. After she died, Andrea said the colors were too dark and stored it away. The hall has felt unfinished to me ever since, though I could not have explained why until that night. The sewing room door stood ajar by perhaps 3 inches. I was almost certain I had left it shut. Not locked, not marked. Just shut in the ordinary way unused rooms are to keep heat where it is needed and dust where it belongs. I put my hand on the knob. The room inside smelled faintly of old cotton cedar from the closet and something sweeter under it. Lavender water, maybe, or the memory of it trapped in fabric. Moonlight from the side garden made a pale bar on the floorboards beneath the windows. The small daybed along the far wall was bare except for a folded coverlet. The work table stood clean. Too clean. The basket where Evelyn once kept mending was gone from its corner by the lamp. The lamp itself remained brass base and cream shade, but angled differently than she would ever have left it. The radiator clicked softly warm. I stepped inside. The room had the peculiar emptiness of a place tidied after truth. I cannot explain that any better than that. It was not haunted. It was not theatrical. It simply felt as though its life had been edited down to what would not trouble visitors. I crossed to the window and touched the sill. Cold there as always. Evelyn used to tap 2 fingers against that sill before closing the curtains at night. A silly little habit of farewell to the garden she claimed was not sentimental, only orderly. I could see her doing it so clearly that for one moment the room seemed to fill with her practical presence, not romance, not ghostliness, just the remembered economy of a woman reaching to preserve heat. Then the memory shifted because once you admit a room might hold a different truth than the one you have told yourself, other memories come looking for admission. I saw her here one afternoon in that last winter, propped against pillows with her reading glasses low on her nose, a tea tray across her knees because she said the light was better for stitching, and she wanted to see the garden even when there was nothing in it to admire. I remembered saying, half teasing, "You're turning your sewing room into a command post." And she, without looking up, saying, "Well, someone in this house should have one." At the time, I laughed. Standing there in the moonlit room, I no longer heard it as a joke. The floorboard near the daybed had a faint rectangular shadow where something heavier had once stood and been moved. A little table, I thought. Bed height, the sort of table you pull close for water. Book's medicine. My eyes went at once, not by reason, by instinct, to the spot where a carafe might have stood. I turned in the quiet and looked toward the closet. The door was open an inch. Inside hung guest blankets and ironing board, Claire's old prom dress under plastic, and nothing of Evelyn in sight. No robe, no shawl, no basket, no little bell she had used at the end when she needed me from another room and did not want to shout. A strange anger, mild but exact, moved through me then, not because those things were gone. After death, things are moved. That is what happens. The living cannot keep every object where it suffered. No. The anger came from not knowing when they had gone, or by whose authority, or whether I had seen them go at all. I left the room and shut the door firmly behind me. In the kitchen, I stood at the counter under the small lamp above the sink and listened to the dishwasher labor through its cycle. The house above me held my family in its rooms. Grandchildren breathing in borrowed beds, my son snoring soon enough in the room that had once been mine and Evelyn's Andrea, no doubt making quiet, final adjustments before sleep. It should have felt full in a good way. Instead, it felt occupied. I told myself I was overtired, over-tender. 3 years into widowhood and still capable of being ambushed by a room, a child, a piece of glass. That explanation would have satisfied me a week earlier. Then I remembered the grocery slip. I went back to the recipe box. My hands were steadier now, which is not the same thing as calmer. I found the yellow paper exactly where I had put it, between the dressing card and the cranberry mold. I carried it under the lamp by the sink and flattened it with my palm. The list itself was ordinary enough. Celery pears, cream he biscuits. At the bottom, in that upright late handwriting of hers, were the words I had already seen. Check sewing room heat. Below that, written smaller perhaps after the first note, and almost at the torn edge, was another line I had missed before because the paper had been folded over on itself. Tea tray downstairs. I looked at the words until the letters blurred. Downstairs. Not sewing room in the abstract, not craft room, not back room. Downstairs, the way you write something when the location has become part of a routine, part of a life. I read it again, and in the silence of the kitchen, the house seemed for the first time in 3 years not to shelter my grief, but to stand opposite it and say plainly that one of us had been lied to. I did not sleep much after that. Not because of fear in the childish sense. I have outlived too many things to frighten easily by dark rooms and creaking steps. It was something meaner than fear and harder to put down. A kind of internal misalignment. As if I had spent 3 years walking through my own house with one shoe half a size too small, and only now, in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve, understood why every room had left me a little tired. I undressed in the master bedroom by lamplight slowly, so as not to wake the old reflex that still expected Evelyn to murmur from the bathroom that I was making a production of my socks. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the chest at the foot of the bed, and under that the sharper, cleaner smell of Andrea's shampoo. She and Eric were sleeping in here now, not because I had been forced out of it, not because there had been some ugly showdown, but because at some point in the first year after Evelyn died, it had simply become easier when family stayed over for me to take the smaller first-floor room off the den and leave the larger bedroom to younger backs and married people and the orderly traffic of grandchildren in the night. I had told myself it was practical. I still believe that in part. Practicality and surrender can look identical from a few feet away. I sat on the edge of the bed in my room downstairs, the den sofa unfolded into the sleeper I used when the house filled up, and listened to the pipes settle. Somewhere above me a toilet flushed. A floorboard gave softly under somebody's late-night step. The dishwasher clicked into silence in the kitchen. Then the house went to that particular Christmas quiet that is never full silence, only a temporary agreement among sleeping bodies and old wood. I lay there and looked at the dark outline of the bookcase across from me and thought of the yellow grocery slip in the recipe box. Tea tray downstairs. It was the sort of line that should not have mattered so much. A sentence so domestic it ought to have dissolved the minute it had done its work. But it would not dissolve. It hung there with Owen's whisper and the wrong green carafe and the too-ordered emptiness of the sewing room and made a shape I could not yet name. At some hour past 2 I gave up on sleep and got out of bed. I did not turn on lights. Moonlight from the back windows was enough to move by, and I have known the path from the den through the dining room into the kitchen too long to need more than the dim shine of the tree lights and whatever the snow outside gave back. The dining room table sat fully set for Christmas dinner. Silver laid out, plates scented, water glasses waiting, Evelyn's cream linen runner down the middle with the old brass candlesticks and the dish of walnuts she used to insist upon, even though nobody but Frank ever cracked them. In the near dark, the table looked as it had looked 100 holidays before. That was the trouble with grief, arranged by ritual. It could counterfeit peace beautifully. I stood at the head of the table and remembered the morning after her funeral. The house had been full then, too. Not with Christmas, of course, but with casseroles and low voices and women in good shoes, carrying foil-covered things into the kitchen as if grief were a weather event best met with starch and broth. I remember coming downstairs before the others and finding the dining room already straightened. Plates stacked, coffee rings wiped, flowers moved out of the way of practical use. Andrea had been at the sideboard in one of Evelyn's aprons, though not one she would have chosen, tying up garbage with quick, efficient motions. "You should not be doing that," I had said. "Somebody should," she answered, not sharply, not unkindly. Then she had looked at me, softened her face, and added, "Tom, just let me help." At the time it had struck me as kindness, and perhaps some part of it had been. What changes now looking back is not the fact of her helping. It is the speed, the seamlessness, the way the house had shifted under her hands before I had even understood that shifting was underway. I went on into the kitchen and stood at the sink. The moonlight pooled pale on the counter, turning the chrome faucet into a thin white line. The recipe box sat where I had left it, squat and square and innocent as a church donation box. I opened it again and took out the grocery slip. Then I opened the drawer below the island where Evelyn kept the church circulars and holiday recipes clipped from newspapers and the little stack of returned Christmas card envelopes she used to mine for addresses next year so she would not have to trust her memory entirely. I told myself I was looking because I was awake, because a line on one slip of paper is not proof of anything, because once you begin giving too much authority to single domestic details, you can turn yourself into a fool. All those things were true. They just were not the deepest truth. The returned card envelopes were bound with a rubber band gone brittle with age. When I slipped it off, it snapped. I sat down at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp and spread the envelopes into a small fan. Florida, Michigan, Dayton, Cincinnati. Neighbor across the street. Then a thick, folded card on cream stock, with the church seal in the corner tucked where it did not belong among the envelopes. Inside were 3 names in different hands, each with a dish listed beneath. The usual meal train card they used when someone was ill or newly widowed, but not from after the funeral. This one was older, dated in the upper corner, 3 weeks before Evelyn died. Chicken noodle soup. Ruth Givens lasagna. Karen Bell. Turkey, tetrazzini. Nancy Sloan. At the bottom, in Dina Walsh's careful church secretary hand, were the words, "Deliver to side. Door garden room preferred. Please knock softly. Garden room preferred." I sat very still. No one in this family had called the sewing room the garden room while Evelyn was alive. It sat at the back of the house and looked out on the garden. Yes, but that was all. The phrase had an outsider's gentleness to it, a name someone would use if told where a patient rested. I read it once, then again, and had the unpleasant sensation that my own memory was developing edges sharper than I wanted. Garden room. Tea tray downstairs. Check sewing room heat. 3 points do not make a map if you are determined enough not to see one. The trouble is that once the lines begin to draw themselves, you have to work harder every minute to remain innocent. A board creaked overhead. I gathered the card and slipped together and slid them into the inside pocket of my robe before I quite knew I had decided to keep them with me. Morning came grey and early. It had snowed again sometime before dawn, not much, just enough to lay a fresh skin over the driveway and the front walk and make the yard look tidier than the season deserved. By 6:30 I had coffee going, sausage browning, cinnamon rolls proofing near the oven, and the orange halves studded with cloves that Evelyn always set in the front hall bowl, beginning to warm the air where the radiator caught them. The house smelled like Christmas and old varnish and the faint wet wool ghost of yesterday's coats. Outside, the maple branches were white-edged. Inside, every practical thing asked to be done in order. It steadied me to do them. I sliced fruit. I laid bacon on the rack. I set the coffee urn near the sideboard in the dining room and heard from upstairs the first dragging foot sounds of children crossing unfamiliar territory to find a bathroom. Owen appeared first in flannel pajamas with snowmen on them, hair sticking up in a dark cowlick on the left side. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, as if uncertain whether he was welcome before the rest. "You beat the sun," I said. He shrugged and climbed onto one of the breakfast stools. "Cocoa or orange juice?" "Juice." I poured it and set the glass in front of him. His fingers went around it, but he did not drink. "Sleep all right?" A nod. "Roads look better." Another nod. He was a child, trying not to be a subject. I knew enough to leave him that mercy for the moment. I turned back to the stove. A few minutes later, Andrea came down in a cream sweater and dark leggings, her hair twisted up, already composed. She paused in the doorway with the look of someone taking stock of a stage before the actors fully entered it. "You're up too early," she said. "You promised." "I did not promise anything of the sort." She smiled and came in, kissing the air near my cheek again. "What can I do?" "Nothing yet." "Tom." "I mean it." Her smile remained, but the edges tightened. "At least let me set out plates. You can when people are awake enough to deserve them." Something moved across her face, then gone almost instantly. Not offense exactly, not even annoyance, more like recalibration. She poured herself coffee and stood by the counter watching the cinnamon rolls rise. "I thought we might move Lucy into the blue room tonight after presents," she said after a minute. She tossed and turned with Claire's snoring. "Did she say that, or did you?" Andrea laughed softly. "You know your daughter snores. I know Lucy doesn't mind much." She took a sip. "It just seems a shame to leave that room untouched all weekend when the kids are on top of each other." There it was again. Untouched. As if she were testing whether I would accept the word. "The room's fine as it is," I said. "For now, of course." "For now," I repeated. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than comfort required, then set down her mug and reached for the fruit bowl. "I'll do the clementines." When she peeled one, the smell leapt bright and sharp into the warm kitchen, a clean burst over bacon grease and coffee. I watched the thin spiral of rind fall against the cutting board and had the absurd thought that Andrea peeled things like she rearranged a room with calm and finality. By 8, the house was fully alive. Lucy wandered in, wrapped in a quilt and talking before her eyes were entirely open. Ben wanted more coffee. Claire stood at the sink in my old Ohio State sweatshirt and informed everyone that she had once again saved Christmas by remembering the inhaler. Eric carved the cinnamon rolls too early and burned his fingers. The children disappeared and reappeared like weather systems. Wrapping paper waited under the tree in patient mounds. If an outsider had walked in, then he would have seen only a good holiday house and a family making the best of modern logistics under old traditions. He would have been right as far as surface goes. That was the hard thing. Nothing monstrous announced itself. The wrongness moved in manners and assumptions and room assignments and what people said when they thought a child was no longer listening. After breakfast, Claire volunteered to help me make the gravy base for later. Andrea took Lucy and Owen upstairs to change out of pajamas before presents. Eric went out to brush snow from the cars just in case, which was his lifelong method of leaving any room where feelings might arrive uninvited. Ben offered to chop walnuts and was sent to the den with the nutcracker because Evelyn never tolerated shell fragments in the kitchen. I was rinsing the roasting pan when I heard the whisper, not eerie, not hidden behind a wall, just low and urgent on the upstairs landing drifting down the stairwell, because the old house carried voices in winter in a way modern houses padded with insulation and private life do not. "No, not that room," Andrea said, Lucy's voice younger and louder, protesting. "But why? It has the pretty wallpaper." "Honey, because I said so." Then Owen too low to catch words. Andrea, again sharper now for the first time all morning. "We don't argue about Grandma's room." The water kept running over my hands. Gravy drippings loosened and swirled away. Beside me, Claire reached for the sieve and did not look up. After a second, she said carefully, "Neutral." Andrea gets weird about that room. I turned off the tap. Weird how Claire shrugged without turning, like it matters more than the others. "It was your mother's room." That was the line, the old line. Saying it aloud cost me more than I expected. Claire finally looked at me. There is something unmerciful in the face of a grown daughter when she is trying not to correct her father. She had Evelyn's eyes and my habit of measuring words before spending them. Was it she said? Very quiet, not confrontational, almost gentle, which made it worse. I dried my hands on the dish towel. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." She shook the sieve over the bowl. "I just mean by the end things got..." She made a small motion with one wrist. Shifted around. Shifted around, how I don't know, Dad. It was chaotic. Andrea handled a lot. There seems to be a great deal Andrea handled that I was not invited to notice. Claire set the sieve down. "That's not fair." No, you were drowning." There are truths that help and truths that land like insult because they arrive before you are ready to forgive them. I looked at my daughter across the sink with turkey grease on my fingers and felt absurdly 14. "I was your mother's husband," I said. "Not a houseplant." Claire's face changed at once. "I didn't mean I know what you meant." She reached out then and touched my forearm, something she had done when she was small, and wanted to bring me back from the edge of irritation. "Dad," she said softly, "don't pick a fight on Christmas because Owen heard half a conversation." My entire body went still. I looked at her hand on my arm, then at her face. "What did you say?" She took her hand back. "I just mean kids hear things." "How do you know what Owen heard?" She opened her mouth, then shut it. There was the cost immediate and clean. Not certainty, not proof, but the knowledge that the child's whisper had not lived in isolation. It had moved through the family already, perhaps only as inconvenience, perhaps as concern, perhaps as one more thing to manage. And I had not been in the room for any of it. Claire saw that I knew. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. It was nothing she said too quickly now. Last month, when Andrea brought the wreaths, Lucy and Owen were playing hide-and-seek. Owen came out of the back hall saying Grandma used to sleep downstairs. Andrea corrected him. That was all. Corrected him how? Told him he was mixing things up. And was he? Claire looked toward the stairs. "Dad, don't. That isn't an answer." She pressed her lips together. "I don't remember," which meant she remembered enough to avoid. Before I could say anything else, Lucy thundered down the stairs in red socks, yelling for scissors, followed by Andrea, with ribbons in one hand and Owen in the other, as if the house itself had decided to rescue everyone from honesty. Claire stepped aside. The moment closed, but not over me. Inside me, it widened. Presents came and went in their annual disorder. Paper tore, tape stuck to fingers. Ben made a production of the hideous tie Claire had bought him. Lucy cried delightedly over a paint set. Owen unwrapped the die-cast farm truck he had been asking for since October and stared at it with such private intensity that for a moment the whole room softened around him. I sat in my chair by the tree and handed out packages and played my part well enough that no one need feel embarrassed for me. Yet through all of it, I was watching rooms. That is the only way to put it. I was not watching people exactly. I was watching where they moved without thought and where they hesitated. Who carried laundry up? Who came down the back hall and shut the sewing room door with an extra inch of care? Who sent Lucy for tape to the den but stopped Owen from following because Grandpa has things in there? The house had become suddenly legible in a grammar I had somehow neglected. Around noon, while the others were occupied with new toys and football and assembling batteries, I went upstairs on the pretense of fetching more wrapping bags from the linen closet. The upstairs landing smelled faintly of shampoo children's new plastic and the warm, dry breath of overworked radiators. Sun struck the runner through the stair window in a thin winter slat. The blue room door stood open wider now. From where I stood, I could see the bed made perfectly, the shawl still folded at the foot, the photo of Evelyn on the dresser. I crossed to the room and stepped inside. Daylight made its false peace crueler. The wallpaper looked almost cheerful. The white coverlet was smoothed hard enough to show finger marks where someone had pressed the corners into place. On the bedside table stood the wrong green carafe, now half full. Beside it, a glass tumbler on a crochet coaster that had never belonged to this room. Evelyn used coasters downstairs because the sewing room table was walnut, and she worried about rings. Upstairs in the guest room, she had always said a grown adult could be trusted with a water glass, and if not, there were worse things than marks on furniture. I opened the drawer of the bedside table. Rosary from some long-ago Catholic relative who had left it by mistake, a packet of tissues, 2 hotel pens, a lip balm that had gone white with age. Nothing of hers. Of course not. But that was not the point. The point was that the objects placed on top of the table were making an argument the drawer itself could not support. I went to the closet and slid the door open. Towels. Not 1 or 2 emergency extras tucked out of sight. A full neat stack of guest towels, bath sheets, even washcloths rolled into a basket at the bottom, like something from a magazine spread about welcoming holiday company. Behind them hung a garment bag, 2 spare pillows, and the portable crib mattress Lucy had long since outgrown. I stood there with my hand still on the closet door and felt a slow, humiliating heat move up my neck. Grandma's room. Untouched. Sacred. And in the closet, folded for practical use, the plain evidence that the room had been serving other household needs all along. That by itself did not mean Evelyn had not died there. Families do contradictory things in grief. We protect what hurts and use it anyway because houses are not museums and children need towels. Yet the contradiction mattered because of the way it had been spoken. The terms, the hush, the management of Owen's words. If the room was a shrine, it was an awfully useful shrine. I closed the closet and turned toward the bed. The mattress dipped slightly on the far side where someone had sat recently. The window above the small writing desk was cracked open by perhaps half an inch for the dry heat. Evelyn would have hated that in winter, not because she disliked fresh air. Because once her breathing worsened, dry-heated upstairs rooms began to set off that small, humiliating cough she tried to hide behind her hand. The memory came whole. One night in late January, maybe 5 weeks before she died, I had found her standing in the upstairs hall outside the blue room, one hand braced to the wallpaper, the other at her throat. We had already begun pretending her weakness belonged to fatigue and age and weather, and not to anything larger moving toward us. Andrea had been downstairs on the phone with the pharmacy. Eric was in the drive trying to get the snowblower started. The whole house smelled of wet scarves and chicken broth and the lemon cleaner Marisol used on Mondays. "What are you doing up here?" I had asked. Evelyn looked annoyed at being caught more than distressed. Finding out whether this room is any drier than ours? For what possible reason? For the deeply irrational reason that I would like to sleep a full night. She stepped into the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and coughed twice the little bark she hated because it made everyone overkind. I moved to close the window, and she waved me off. "No," she said. "That's worse. Then the air just sits. "You're not sleeping up here. I was testing it, not moving in." At the time I had smiled, helped her back downstairs and said something husbandly and reassuring about doctors and humidifiers and getting through winter. Now standing in the blue room on Christmas Day with the wrong green glass in my hand, the memory changed shape. She had not been curious. She had been trying to solve a problem. She had been measuring rooms against a body that no longer met the house the way it used to. I put the glass back down more carefully than before. On the landing outside, a board whispered underfoot. I turned. Marisol stood by the linen closet, holding a stack of sheets against her hip. She had been coming to this house every Tuesday for 14 years. Not family, no, but more woven into the domestic fabric than some blood relatives. A short woman with square shoulders and watchful eyes, who moved through a room with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that middle-class sorrow often prefers invisible labor. Evelyn trusted her. That matters. "Sorry," she said when she saw me. "I didn't know you were in here." "That's all right." Her gaze flicked once to the closet, then to the bedside table, then back to me. "No more than that." "But enough. You changing beds?" I asked. "Yes, sir." "In this room too?" A beat. Whatever Andrea wrote down. There are answers that reveal themselves by refusing more than their surface duty. I stepped into the hall. Marisol. She stopped. "Did Evelyn sleep in here at the end?" The sheets in her arms shifted slightly. Her face did not at first. Then something very small and very human happened around her mouth. Not fear alone. Calculation, maybe. Or the weary alarm of a person who has spent years knowing exactly which truths are expensive. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do." Her eyes moved toward the staircase, down toward the kitchen where voices floated up. Then back to me. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly. "It's Christmas." That is not an answer either. Her fingers tightened once in the fabric. "I need to change the girl's room." She went around me, then not hurried but definite, and into Lucy's room with the sheets. The door closed with a softness that felt more final than a slam. I remained on the landing a long moment. By 3 in the afternoon, the house had become wrong in specific ways. The blue room's closet no longer read as incidental storage to me. It read as practical use, hiding inside declared reverence. The back hall runner I no longer had felt incomplete, not merely because Andrea had preferred something lighter, but because the space had been simplified, stripped of witness. The sewing room's radiator ran warmer than the den's, though nobody admitted needing the room. Towels traveled upstairs and down on routes I had never tracked, because until now I had not understood that a towel's destination might be testimony. This is what happens when a house ceases to be background and starts acting like evidence. Even harmless things begin arriving with a shadow. I found another one in the dining room an hour before dinner. Claire had sent me to the sideboard for the silver butter spreaders while she and Lucy set out the rolls. The sideboard drawers had been Evelyn's kingdom of practical abundance linens stacked by occasion. Silver nested by service. Odd little inherited serving pieces no one used, but no one threw away. Since the funeral, Andrea had helped by streamlining some of it, which meant there were labels on the inner drawer dividers, now in a small, neat hand. Dessert forks, child cups, holiday napkins. I hated the labels, and had not said so because it seemed ungrateful to object to organization in the wake of disorder. I opened the lower left drawer and found under the stack of Christmas napkins another of the church meal cards. Not tucked there with intention, I thought at first. Merely trapped. But then I saw that it had been folded around a note in Evelyn's hand on one of the small square pads she used by the telephone. Use side door. Too much stair traffic front hall. I sat down at the dining room table without meaning to. Stair traffic. The note was not an announcement of catastrophe. It was domestic logistics. That made it hit harder. Too much stair traffic front hall. The kind of practical adjustment a woman makes when she has given up expecting the house to revolve around her and instead begins rooting around its strain. I looked up toward the back of the house, toward the corridor leading to the sewing room and side door. I could see in memory now with brutal clarity 2 women from church carrying covered dishes that final month and coming in through the side path because the front walk had not been shoveled well after a storm. At the time, I had been upstairs arguing by phone with insurance over a piece of equipment I no longer even remember. Andrea had taken the casseroles from them. Evelyn had called out some dry remark from the back hall about everybody feeding us like geese. I had laughed from the landing and gone back to the phone. I had been in the house. That was the part that hurt. Not absent, not at work across town, not unconscious. In the house and still consenting to my own partial blindness because it kept the machinery of care from asking more of me than I thought I could bear. Ben came in looking for the nut bowl and stopped when he saw my face. "You all right, Tom?" "Yes." "You sure?" "Do I look unsure?" He gave a little huff, uncertain whether humor was wanted. "You look like you just read tax law." "Worse," I said, folding the note into my palm. "Church handwriting." He laughed politely and went to the kitchen. I put the note in my robe pocket with the others. By then I knew I needed somebody outside the family to tell me whether the picture taking shape in my head was memory, finally straightening itself, or grief, curdling into suspicion. You can trust household detail only so far before you start to hear your own needs speaking through it. I knew that. I have known practical men and women my whole life who turned coincidence into persecution because it was easier than accepting confusion. I had no intention of becoming one of them, which meant I needed a clean fact from outside the house. The problem was that Christmas afternoon is not built for fact-finding. It is built for ham glaze and batteries and children losing pieces of things. Still around 4:30, while the others were occupied with a card game in the den, and Andrea was upstairs helping Lucy into a sweater too fancy for comfort. I slipped to the front hall table where the old address book still sat in its drawer. Hospice people came and went during those last weeks. Most of the names blurred now into kindness and clipboards and shoes quietly removed at the door. But one came back to me, Lydia Bell, intake nurse, solid gray bob, leather planner. The kind of woman who could say we need to adjust this setup without making you feel you had failed an exam you did not know you were taking. I found the number in the book beside the name of the agency written in my own hand from 3 winters ago. I stood there with the phone receiver in my hand for longer than I should have. Calling an old hospice nurse on Christmas afternoon to ask where your wife slept before she died is not the act of a settled man. I knew that too. Yet by then, the alternatives had become worse. Ask Eric again and get fog. Ask Claire and receive pity. Ask Andrea and announce that I was no longer moving quietly under her version of the house. Ask Marisol and put the burden of class and employment squarely on the shoulders of the one person least free to spend truth recklessly. No, if Lydia remembered anything, she would remember it as fact. If she didn't, then I would at least know the limits of my own reach. I dialed. The phone rang 4 times. I was about to hang up when a woman answered, a voice, warm and direct and slightly distracted by what sounded like television in another room. "Hello, Lydia Bell." "Yes. This is Thomas Mercer. Tom Mercer. I'm sorry to disturb you on Christmas." A pause. Then Mr. Mercer. Something in the recognition tightened my throat. "I hope I haven't caught you badly." No. My grandchildren are in the basement making enough noise to raise their great-grandfather, but I've survived worse." "Are you all right?" It was such an ordinary, professional kindness that for a second I nearly said yes, and ended the call. I'm not sure I said instead. The television sound receded. Perhaps she shut a door. "What's going on?" I looked over my shoulder. The den was still loud with cards and laughter. Nobody stood in the hall. I lowered my voice without intending to. "I need to ask you something strange." "Go ahead. It's about Evelyn." Another small pause, respectful now. "All right. I found some things in the house that don't line up with what I thought I remembered, or what I was told. And before I make a fool of myself with my family, I need to know whether I'm confused." She did not speak immediately, which made me trust her more. "What do you need to know?" she asked at last. I could hear my own pulse in my ear. During the time you came out for intake during that last month? What room was my wife sleeping in? No intake nurse, no. Kindly retired professional is required to remember the sleeping arrangements of one dying woman in one Ohio house 3 years after the fact. As soon as the question left me, I understood how absurd it sounded. I prepared myself for uncertainty, for the mercy of not knowing. Instead, Lydia said almost at once, "Downstairs." The word entered me cleanly. In the little room at the back, she went on. "Sewing room, I think you called it. First floor because of the stairs." I closed my eyes. "You remember that clearly?" "Yes." "How?" "Because we had to adjust the intake around it. Fall risk on the staircase, trouble with overnight breathlessness, need for the side door access if equipment had to come in. Your wife made a joke about running mission control from the garden windows." A small exhale that might have been a memory smile. I remember because she was trying hard not to let the room feel medical. My hand tightened on the receiver until it hurt. Not because she had said something surprising. By then, surprise had already been hollowed out of me in pieces. No. It was the clarity, the simple lack of fog. Downstairs. Sewing room. First floor because of the stairs. Mission control. The exact domestic logic of it landed with the force of a door closing on the old false belief I had spent 3 years treating as merciful fact. I put my free hand on the front hall table to steady myself. "And not upstairs," I heard myself say, hating how weak it sounded. "Not when I was there," Lydia said. "No." She may have rested in more than one room before things settled, but by then, she was downstairs. "Mr. Mercer." I opened my eyes. The wreath on the door blurred, then steadied. "Yes." "Did someone tell you otherwise?" From the den came a burst of laughter. Eric's unmistakably. The sound moved through me like something blunt. "Yes," I said. Lydia did not ask who. "Then I'm sorry," she said, "and there was no decoration in it." "I'm very sorry." I stood there in my own front hall on Christmas afternoon with my family 15 feet away and felt the entire house tilt, not physically but morally, the way a room can tilt when the story holding it upright goes false all at once. My wife had not died in the room we had spent 3 years protecting. She had not spent her last weeks where the photograph sat, and the shawl was folded and the child had been taught to lower his voice. She had been downstairs in the small room at the back of the house near the side door and the garden and the kitchen kettle she could still hear. And all the reverent hush upstairs, all the talk of Grandma's room, all the careful management of traffic and feeling none of it had been memory. It had been arrangement. "Mr. Mercer," Lydia said again. I swallowed. "Thank you. Do you need anything else from me?" I thought of asking for records. Dates, copies, some external thing to press against the family until truth bruised. But I was not there yet. I was still in the front hall, still feeling the old belief collapse in real time, still not certain whether the greater injury was what had been done or that I had let it live under my roof unquestioned. "No," I said. "Not yet. If you do call me, I will." After we hung up, I remained with the receiver in my hand long enough for it to go dead and begin that hollow, unbroken tone. From upstairs came Owen's feet running, then Andrea's voice telling him to slow down on the landing. From the kitchen came Claire calling for more butter. From the den came the card game continuing without me, as family life always does, unless someone is brave enough to stop it. I set the receiver back in its cradle with great care. Then I stood very still and understood with a coldness deeper than fear that the house had not been misremembered by accident. It had been spoken over. I do not know how long I stood in the front hall after Lydia Bell told me plainly where my wife had slept. Long enough for the receiver to cool in my hand. Long enough for the house to seem for one thin and bitter minute arranged around the wrong center. From the den came another burst of laughter. Then Lucy's high voice arguing over some card rule, then Ben's mild mock solemnity, then Eric telling somebody not to cheat their grandfather, while his actual grandfather stood 10 feet away, learning that the family story of his wife's last weeks had not merely blurred over time. It had been built, chosen, repeated until it hardened into something no one even felt obliged to name as a choice anymore. I did not go into the den. I went instead to the dining room and stood beside the sideboard with both hands flat against the polished wood until the room stopped moving around me. On the mantel above the gas fireplace, the garland glowed with small white lights. The brass candlesticks caught them and returned them warm. The tree in the front room blinked in patient red and gold through the doorway. From where I stood, I could see the narrow strip of rug leading toward the back hall, could see the house divided in clean old lines I had trusted all my life: public room, service room, stairs, hall, kitchen. I had believed foolishly and with gratitude that grief moved through those same lines honestly. That if a room had become sacred, it had done so because love and pain had settled there naturally, and the rest of us had merely agreed to lower our voices. But rooms do not become sacred on their own. People make them so, and people can lie. Claire came into the dining room carrying 2 empty mugs and stopped when she saw me. "Dad." I turned. Something in my face must have told her enough to make her leave the mugs where they were and shut the dining room door halfway behind her. "What happened?" I looked at my daughter, at Evelyn's eyes in a face more lined now than I still remembered her being, at the slight crease between her brows she got when she thought she had been careless with someone she loved. I wanted for 1 weak second to say nothing, to let the afternoon go on, to let Christmas remain in one piece until tomorrow, or next week, or forever, if forever was the price of not having to watch my children stand inside the shape of what they had accepted. Instead, I called Lydia Bell. Claire went still, and she remembered exactly where your mother was sleeping when they came for intake. Claire did not ask which room. That told me enough before she spoke. She said downstairs, I said. My daughter closed her eyes. It was not outrage in me then, not yet. Outrage is cleaner. What I felt was something more painful and more embarrassing. The shame of having needed an outsider to tell me what one of my own children already knew well enough not to challenge. "How long?" I asked. Claire opened her eyes. "Dad, how long did you know the Blue Room story was wrong?" She crossed her arms, not defensively, but to hold herself together. "I didn't think of it as a story. That is a poor answer." "I know." "How long?" She looked at the sideboard instead of me. By the last month she was downstairs most of the time. Then all the time. Most of the time, I repeated. Then all the time. "I didn't mean—" "No," I said. "You meant exactly that." I sat down in Evelyn's chair at the end of the table because my knees had decided for me. Claire remained standing. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "You were there." That landed harder than any lie could have. "I was there," I said. "You were exhausted. You were sleeping in snippets. You kept forgetting when you'd taken your own blood pressure medicine. You were trying so hard to keep everything normal that nobody knew what to do with you except help." There it was again. "Help!" I laughed once, and the sound in that room was ugly enough that Claire flinched. Is that what this was? It started that way. That answer was honest enough to hurt. I watched my daughter's face and thought of Evelyn, saying, "They're all very helpful as long as help means they get to decide." "When did it stop?" I asked. Claire swallowed. "I don't know." "Try." She pressed her lips together. "After the funeral, maybe. Or before. I don't know exactly." Andrea said the Blue Room would be easier for visitors, more comfortable, less upsetting than having people drift through the sewing room and the back hall. She said you needed one clean place to grieve. And what did you say? I thought she might be right. Did Eric? Yes. Of course he did. Eric had been agreeing with stronger wills since 7th grade and calling it diplomacy. "And you all just let it become true?" I asked. "In the house, in front of the children, in front of me." "Dad, It wasn't like that. What was it like? Claire finally looked straight at me then, and there was pain in it, but not surprise. She had feared this moment already, perhaps for years. It was like everyone was drowning differently, she said. Andrea handled things. She always handles things. The church women came. People asked where Mom had been at the end. Andrea said the blue room. Nobody corrected her because it sounded gentler, and because by then the room downstairs looked... She stopped. Looked what small, she said, and makeshift, and unfair. I stared at my daughter. There it is, I said softly. The truth you all could not stand. Not that your mother suffered. Not that she died. That she died in a room that did not look the way you wanted suffering to look. Claire's face crumpled a little then, just around the mouth. That isn't fair. Nor was it. She sat at last in the chair beside me. For what it's worth, she said after a moment, I always knew she liked it better downstairs by the end. Liked it better. You know what I mean. I did. That was the worst part. I knew exactly what she meant. Better did not mean good. Better meant closer to the kitchen, easier for the tray, warmer on the right side in the afternoon, no stairs. Better meant the terms by which a failing body bargains with a beloved house. Did she ask for it, I said. Claire hesitated. Did she ask to be downstairs? Yes, she said at last. At first, then it just stayed. And after what? After it stayed. After everyone decided the room upstairs was prettier. After the sewing room became too small and unfair for the story. Did anyone ask what your mother would have wanted? Then, Claire did not answer. She did not need to. The door opened a few inches and Lucy poked her head in. Mom says, "Are you two hiding the whipped cream?" Claire turned at once, grateful and miserable at once. In the fridge left side, honey. Lucy vanished. Claire stood. Dad? I did not look up. Please don't do anything in front of the kids today. That sentence told me more than anything she had said before it. Not because it was wrong to protect children. It was the natural request. But because requests like that have a way of arriving only when the adults already know a line has been crossed and would prefer the reckoning to wait until after the meal. Go back to your children, I said. She did not move at first. Then she left. I remained at the table long enough for the lights on the garland to warm against my vision and blur. When I finally rose, I did not feel calmer. I felt arranged the way a man feels after the surgeon has told him the truth, and all that remains is deciding whether he will now behave as if he heard it. I went into the den because I needed to see the family with my new knowledge inside me, needed to know whether the house looked different only in emptier rooms or also in full ones. Ben was on the floor building something with Owen and Lucy that involved magnetic tiles and great confidence. Eric sat in the armchair by the tree nursing a beer. Andrea was at the secretary desk near the window with her back half-turned, pencil tucked into her hair, writing something in the small leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. Holidays became logistics. She looked up when I entered and smiled with that composed domestic brightness that used to read as relief and now read as surveillance, softened by manners. "There you are," she said. "I was just making a list for dinner so I don't forget the serving order." Serving order. In my house. "Good," I said. Her smile held. "You sound tired." "I am." "Sit down." "Eric, get your father another beer." "I don't want a beer." "Tea, then," she asked. The question was kindness on its face. But there was a structure inside it suddenly impossible not to see. She named the options. She directed the room. She placed me where a tired older man ought to go. It was subtle enough that had I tried to explain it aloud to anyone 2 days earlier, I would have sounded ungrateful or proud or both. "I'll get it if I want it," I said. Andrea's pencil stilled for just a fraction of a second. "Of course." Owen looked up from the floor at that. Ben did too. Children and sons-in-law know when a room has taken one wrong step, even if they do not know the source. I moved to the secretary desk and looked down. She had one page filled with tidy small writing under the heading Christmas dinner/sleeping. Names, times, who liked what gravy boat, where extra blankets were stored, which children needed baths first. It was the sort of list that keeps a family holiday from dissolving into chaos. The sort of list that had probably saved my skin more than once in the last 3 years. I might have respected it if I had not turned slightly and seen beneath the open page the corner of another sheet half tucked under the blotter. Not because it was hidden, because it was not hidden enough. The way a person leaves something among her own tools because she has forgotten she is working in another man's house. "What's that?" I asked. Andrea looked down, then up. "Insurance brochure. From that place Eric mentioned." "What place?" "A cottage community in Dublin." Her tone remained even. "We were talking generally months ago. It doesn't matter." Something very old and very straight in me rose then and locked into place. I touched the corner of the paper with one finger. "Doesn't it?" Eric shifted in his chair. "Dad, it's not." I looked at him and he stopped. Andrea slid the top notebook over the paper with the smoothness of a card player hiding nothing and everything. "Tom, honestly, not now. There are few phrases more dangerous in family life than not now. It almost always means you have arrived too close to the truth for the comfort of the person speaking." Lucy chose that instant to hold up her tile construction and shout that it was a castle for rabbits. The room broke around her. Ben admired it. Owen laughed. Andrea lowered her eyes and wrote something else in the notebook. Eric looked at the floor. I stood there with my hand on the desk and understood with absolute clarity that if I challenged this in the den at that moment, the story would become my timing, my grief, my instability, not the paper under her hand. So I smiled. It cost me something to do it. That is why I knew it mattered. "Of course," I said. "Not now." Andrea's shoulders loosened by 1 degree. She thought she had been granted time. I had never before in my life consciously decided to let another person underestimate me. The knowledge sat in me, oddly not like deceit, but like cold weather. Unpleasant, necessary. I went to the kitchen and made myself tea I did not want. From there I could see through the little interior window into the back hall. The sewing room door was shut. The hall cupboard, beneath the old coat hooks, stood closed to painted cream 30 years ago and chipped at the latch. It had once stored boots and picnic blankets, and later the children's softball gear. In the last few years, it had become a general overflow cabinet, because overflow, like grief, always needs somewhere to be put where nobody need call it by its true size. Marisol came in from the laundry room, carrying folded dish towels. "Marisol," I said. She startled slightly. Not at my voice, at being addressed alone. "Yes, Mr. Mercer. Can you hand me the tray from the top shelf there?" She set down the towels and reached for it without question. A silver serving tray, little used, wrapped in a dish towel to keep it from scratching the paint. "Not that one," I said. "The lower shelf." She froze. On the lower shelf sat a stack of paper goods boxes, one picnic cooler, and a shallow wicker basket I had not noticed before because the cabinet door hid it unless you stood directly in front. "I can get it," she said quickly. I stepped forward before she could. Inside the basket were old cloth napkins, a cracked picture frame with no picture, 3 taper candles, and under those a small brass bell. I knew it before I picked it up. Not because bells are rare things. Because my thumb found the worn place on the handle where Evelyn's fingers had polished it from use. The room around me narrowed. It was a ridiculous little bell. Not elegant, not antique. Something we had bought years earlier for calling children to supper from the yard, until at the end Evelyn used it from the sewing room when she needed me and did not want to shout because shouting made her cough. Twice. Always twice, light and irritated, as if needing help were in itself a minor scheduling inconvenience. I held it in my hand and looked at Marisol. Her face had gone the color of paper. "Why is this in here?" I asked. "I was told to clear the room after." By whom? She looked toward the doorway. No one there. Marisol. The bell was very light. It felt obscene in that moment, light as a lie. Mrs. Andrea said guests would be coming and that some things looked too much. Too much what she said, too sick. The words came out almost soundless. I stared at her. The house around us went on being a house. Somewhere in the den, somebody laughed. The kettle began to tick quietly toward a boil on the stove. A child ran overhead, and here in my own back hall, the small object my wife had used to call me when she was too weak to raise her voice had been boxed into overflow because it looked too much like the truth. What else, I asked. Marisol shook her head at once. Too fast. What else was taken out of that room I don't know. That is not true. Tears came to her eyes then, not dramatic, not spilling just there. Please, she whispered. I need this job. There are forms of power more embarrassing to encounter than violence. Standing there with the bell in my hand, and a woman frightened of honesty because my family had made silence part of the wages, I felt not anger first, but shame that the house I thought I had kept decent had grown into this sort of place. I am not going to hurt your job, I said. You can't promise that. No, I thought. I couldn't. Not because I lacked the will. Because the machinery of a household once captured by one person's competence does not release its smaller gears cleanly. I put the bell back in the basket with more care than I had used removing it. All right, I said. Not now. Her shoulders dropped in visible relief and horror at once. She took the dish towels and fled into the laundry room without another word. I stood alone in the back hall and listened to the kettle begin to sing. There is a moment in certain illnesses when the doctor stops saying, let's wait, and begins saying, here's what we do next. The tone changes before the content does. A house can do that too. By late afternoon, mine had stopped being a place that merely withheld truth and become a place that was actively arranged to keep certain truths from touching the people most entitled to them. I turned off the kettle, poured my tea, and took it cold into the den. Andrea looked up again from her notebook. She had switched pages now. Her pencil moved in the same tidy strokes. I sat in the wingback near the fire and watched her over the rim of the cup until the warmth died in my hands. At some point she rose to fetch more tape for Lucy and left the notebook on the desk. Eric followed the children into the front hall to test a remote control toy. Ben went out to the garage for batteries. Claire took a phone call in the kitchen. The room emptied with the miraculous convenience families call coincidence when they do not want to examine structure. I crossed to the desk, opened the notebook where she had left it, and turned back one page. I found dinner notes first, guest beds, breakfast, strata timing. Then halfway down the preceding page in her neat compact hand. After holiday weekend revisit, Dublin cottages / memory room issue / Eric to talk gently. / emphasize fewer stairs. Simpler maintenance social support. I read it once, then again. Memory room issue. Not grief, not dad's readiness, not house upkeep, memory room issue. The room they had built into false sanctity upstairs had not merely prettified Evelyn's death. It had become part of a file on me. A rationale. Something to be discussed alongside stairs and maintenance and social support, as if my wife's rearranged memory were one more household variable in a transition plan. I turned the page with hands gone suddenly very precise. There was a brochure folded into the back cover. Willow Trace Cottages, independent senior living with optional care tiers. Pictures of smiling couples who had not yet learned what the phrase optional share means after 70. Someone had circled a paragraph in pencil, familiar routines preserved in a manageable footprint. Familiar routines preserved. I almost laughed. Instead, I slipped the brochure out, folded it once, and slid it into the inner pocket of my robe with the meal cards and the grocery slip. Then I replaced the notebook exactly as it had been. When Andrea came back, she found me in the chair by the fire, watching Owen guide his new farm truck between the rug fringe like a careful little plow. She smiled at me. Not gratefully, assessingly. I smiled back. For the first time in my life, I think I understood how frightening a calm person can be when she believes all the rooms already belong to her. Dinner preparation began in earnest around 5. I made a point of directing it, not dramatically. I did not bark orders or reclaim countertops with theatrical male energy. I simply resumed using my own kitchen the way I had once used it beside Evelyn, by naming tasks and assigning them before Andrea could. Ben to the potatoes, Claire to the salad, Eric to the wine glasses, Lucy and Owen to napkin duty under supervision, Andrea to nothing at all until she asked, at which point I gave her the cranberries because they required attention but not authority. She handled the saucepan with her usual efficiency. If she resented the displacement, she did not show it. That was what made her dangerous. She could obey and still hold the shape of command around herself like perfume after a woman leaves a room. At one point, while Claire and Lucy were setting the table, Andrea stepped close beside me at the stove and said in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear, "You've been very quiet." I kept my eyes on the gravy. "So have you," I said. "I'm just trying to make this a good day." The phrase was beautifully chosen. No accusation in it, only implication. If the day ceased being good, whose fault would that appear to be, for whom I asked? She stirred cranberries once carefully. "For everyone." I looked at her then. She met my gaze steadily. Her face was composed, almost kind. There was no rant in it, no villainy a child would recognize. Only the confidence of a person who had been obeyed long enough to believe obedience and correctness were cousins. "Do you know what Lydia Bell told me this afternoon?" I asked. The wooden spoon in her hand stopped moving. Only for a heartbeat. "No," she said. "She told me my wife was sleeping downstairs." Andrea set the spoon down on the saucer and turned off the burner beneath her pan, all without hurry. "I see." That was all. Not surprise, not denial, not even immediate explanation. Just, "I see," as if I had informed her a guest would be arriving after all. "You might have mentioned that at some point," I said. I didn't realize it was in dispute. There it was. Calm correction. The room around us full of family, and inside the smallest available privacy she was already moving to language. Not a lie, exactly. Something slipperier. The kind that asks whether the problem is the fact or your insufficiently flexible interpretation of it. "It became in dispute," I said, "when everyone in this house started calling the blue room your mother's room." Andrea picked up the spoon again and gave the cranberries one absent stir, though the burner was off. "Tom, by the end, Evelyn used several rooms." "No." She rested where she was comfortable. "No." No." I turned fully toward her now. "Do not narrate my wife to me in my kitchen." For the first time that day, something unmasked in her expression. Not rage. Contempt would be too theatrical a word. Something colder and more intimate than contempt, impatience with an obstacle that has unexpectedly begun speaking. She lowered her voice further. "Then maybe don't force this in front of the children." The skill of it almost impressed me. Within seconds, the matter had become not what she had done or accepted or helped make useful, but whether I would be indecorous enough to object while family sat down to dinner. I leaned one hand on the counter because the urge to strike something had come upon me so suddenly and so unfamiliar that I needed to anchor it. "I'm not forcing anything," I said. "I'm learning what already happened." Andrea's face smoothed again. "Good," she said. "Then learn it privately." She lifted the cranberry bowl and walked it to the table. I stood at the stove with the gravy spoon in my hand, and knew with a deep, exhausted certainty that the lie belonged not only to the past. It was still active. It was still being administered, by tone, by timing, by the social pressure of what was suitable and who must be protected from unpleasantness. Family peace, I realized, was not a condition in this house anymore. It was a management strategy. Just before we sat down, I made my move. It was not grand. That is why it mattered. in the confusion of children washing hands, and Claire hunting the serving fork, and Ben opening another bottle of wine. I went to the back hall cupboard, took out the brass bell and the folded meal train card, and carried them to the den. From the secretary desk, while no one was looking directly at me, I took Andrea's notebook, removed the brochure I had already pocketed from the back cover, and placed the notebook itself under the cushion of the wing chair where I had been sitting. Then I took the yellow grocery slip and Evelyn's side door note from my robe pocket and slid them into the inside drawer of the dining room sideboard beneath the Christmas napkins, where I would know exactly how to reach them later. Not to hide them from myself, to stage the truth for use. The act felt terrible and clean at once. I had spent 3 years being acted upon by order. Now I was making order answer to me. There remained one thing I needed before dinner, if I could get at the real green carafe. I did not know precisely where it was, only where it was not. Not upstairs. Not on the guest room table where its counterfeit sat, not in the everyday glass cabinet, not in the dish drainer, not on the pantry shelf, not among the pieces Claire had boxed after the funeral and stored in the basement, because I had looked there myself that first spring when grief still made scavengers of us all. The laundry room seemed most likely not because it was logical, but because logic in this house had lately begun disguising itself as overflow. I waited until everyone had drifted toward the dining room, voices gathering their chairs, scuffing Claire, calling that dinner was getting cold. Then I slipped through the kitchen into the little laundry room off the back hall and shut the door behind me. This was the most suspenseful 5 minutes of my life, though, if you had described it to a younger man. He might have laughed at the smallness of it. No gun, no knife, no police in the drive. Only an old laundry room at Christmas detergent smell and the faint iron heat of the dryer shelves crowded with paper towels, stain remover, old canning jars, 2 baskets of mismatched socks, a sewing machine cover, and 3 banker's boxes stacked under the utility sink. I pulled out the first box. Receipts, school art, a tangle of extension cords. Nothing. The second held holiday tablecloths, Easter wreaths, a cracked ceramic rabbit. The third was heavier. I dragged it out by both handles and knelt on the cold vinyl floor. At that exact moment, I heard footsteps in the back hall and the dry little clink of serving spoons. The footsteps paused outside the door. I did not breathe. Tom Andrea called through the wood voice light. "We're sitting down." My hand was already inside the box beneath a folded blue quilt. I touched glass. "Be right there," I said. No answer. Only the pause, 1 second longer than needed, then the footsteps moving away. I lifted the quilt. Under it lay a stack of things so ordinary and so damning that for a moment the room seemed to lose air. Evelyn's lumbar pillow in the striped case she used in the sewing room daybed. The cream tray with the little lip on the edge where I used to set her soup and tea. Her brass-based reading lamp with the repaired pull chain wrapped in newspaper. And under the lamp, nested in an old towel, the real green glass carafe and tumbler. I took it out with both hands. There was the trapped bubble in the base catching the laundry room bulb in a green wink. I sat back on my heels. Of all the things I had found that day, this was the one that broke whatever remained of the old false belief. Not because it was the clearest proof on paper, because it was mine. Ours. A husband's object. The thing I had filled at night with cold tap water while she arranged the pillows and coughed into a handkerchief and told me not to fuss with the blankets if I was only going to leave the corner tucked wrong. That carafe had belonged to a routine no one else in the house had understood well enough to counterfeit entirely. And they had boxed it, wrapped it, replaced it with a smoother, prettier substitute upstairs, and left this one hidden with the equipment of the room that looked too much like the truth. I heard the house differently then, not as memory archive, not as shelter, as system. The hot water pipe knocked once behind the washer. A child laughed from the dining room far away now. Somewhere a chair scraped, and in my hands the glass was cold. I set the tumbler down and lifted the lamp instead. Under it, folded into the towel, was one more paper. Not a note. Nothing so convenient. A printed email. Andrea's email header at the top. 3 weeks after the funeral, forwarded to Eric. Need to keep Tom settled upstairs with the memory room story for now. If he starts reopening downstairs or asking Marisol to pull things back out, it will undo all the progress. We can revisit cottages after New Year when he's less raw. Framing it around fewer stairs / less maintenance / preserving routines is still the kindest way. I read it once. Then again, though, the words had already carved themselves into me. Memory room story, not confusion, not mercy that got out of hand. Story. For now, undo all the progress. The paper shook in my hand, not from age from me. There are betrayals that injure you because they reveal malice. There are others perhaps worse that injure because they reveal process. This had not been one lie told in a bad moment. It had been discussed, named leveraged, folded into a plan for my future, while I sat in the same house, believing grief had merely taken odd practical forms. I do not remember standing up. I remember only carrying the carafe and the email to the utility sink, setting the paper down where no water could touch it, and turning on the tap. Cold water rushed clear over the green glass, over the bubble in the base, over my fingers. I washed the carafe the way Evelyn liked it, washed with the soft bottle brush inside first, then a clean rinse, then set upside down on a folded towel. An absurdly tender thing to do in the middle of fury, but that was the point. I was no longer touching proof. I was touching the life they had tried to edit. When I shut off the water, the room was silent again. I looked at the folded email on the sink ledge, then at the boxed lamp and pillow and tray, then at the closed laundry room door. There are roads in life that disappear unless you step onto them before the weather changes. If I folded that email back into the towel and went to dinner and let one more meal happen under the old arrangement, then tomorrow would become next week, and next week would become some negotiated private conversation in which Andrea would explain and Eric would regret and Claire would cry and everyone would ask me to understand that people had done their best in hard circumstances. Perhaps some of that would even be true, but my wife would still have been made smaller in memory, and I would have helped. I picked up the email, dried my hands carefully on the towel, and tucked the paper into my robe pocket with the others. Then I lifted the real green carafe and carried it into the kitchen. No one was there. The dining room beyond was full warm, alive with the sounds of family beginning. Christmas dinner. Forks, chairs, Lucy asking for the rolls, Ben making some harmless joke, Claire telling him not to start. Andrea's voice moved among the others, composed and efficient, distributing dishes. I set the carafe in the sink beside the colander and looked at it in the bright kitchen light. It did not look like evidence there. It looked like marriage. I took a clean cloth and polished the last drops from the base. Then I walked into the dining room. Everyone was seated except me. My chair stood at the head of the table beneath the chandelier Evelyn had always thought too formal for our tastes, but too expensive to replace, so we lived with it long enough that it became ours. The candles were lit. The turkey waited on the platter. The children's faces shone with heat and sugar and tiredness. Andrea sat halfway down the table on my right napkin in her lap, expression composed. For a second, nobody noticed what I held. Then Owen did. His eyes went wide. Eric followed his gaze. The color changed in his face almost invisibly. Andrea looked last. When she saw the carafe, she did not gasp or blanch or reach theatrically for her wine glass. She only grew very still, the way a person grows still when a private arrangement has appeared in public intact. I set the carafe down on the sideboard beside the cranberry bowl. No one spoke. I took my seat. Then in the full warmth and silence of the Christmas table, with my family waiting and the email in my pocket and the truth arranged now within reach of my own hands, I unfolded my napkin and understood with a calm so complete it felt like winter that the confrontation would happen tonight. I unfolded my napkin and laid it across my lap as if the evening were going to proceed in the ordinary way. Claire reached for the platter. Ben lifted the wine. Lucy asked if she could have only the crispy potatoes and none of the beans, because Christmas should not involve green vegetables. Owen did not take his eyes off the carafe on the sideboard. Andrea was the first to recover her voice. "That's lovely," she said, looking not at me but at the green glass. I'd wondered where that had gone. There are moments when a room offers you all at once the whole shape of a person's strategy. She could have denied. She could have asked questions. She could have gone still and waited. Instead, she chose the smoothest available normalcy, as if objects misplaced themselves in holiday houses all the time, and husbands brought them to dinner because they had suddenly remembered an antique preference. I looked at her. No, I said. You hadn't. The room quieted in layers. Not instantly. Claire still had one hand on the platter. Ben still held the bottle tilted over Eric's glass. Lucy still looked from one adult face to another, trying to decide whether this was an interesting silence or a dangerous one. But the warmth shifted. The easy machinery of family dinner lost one gear, then another. Andrea folded her hands lightly on the tablecloth. Tom. No, I said again more evenly. You knew exactly where it had gone. That's why it was in a box under the utility sink with Evelyn's lamp, her back pillow, and the tray she used when she was too tired to come to the table. Lucy frowned. Who's Evelyn? Claire closed her eyes for half a second. Grandma, honey. The child looked embarrassed and sat back. Owen kept watching me. Eric set down his fork. Dad, don't, I said. I had imagined anger, I suppose. A righteous tremor, a cracking voice, something worthy of the theatrical idea of confrontation. Instead, what came was clarity. That was better. Anger can be argued with. Clarity cannot. I looked down the table at my family, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt not like the aging man whose grief everyone must step carefully around, but like the owner of the house, the husband of the dead woman, and the only person in the room who had finally decided not to let manners outrank truth. Eat if you like, I said. I'm not keeping the children from supper. But after dinner, we are going to walk this house, and before the night is over, nobody in it will be able to say again that Evelyn died upstairs. Lucy turned to Claire at once. Mom. It's all right, Claire said too quickly. No, I said. It isn't. But she can finish her potatoes. Andrea took a breath. Tom, this is not appropriate. Appropriate, I said, is an interesting word from you. Ben slowly lowered the wine bottle back to the table. I was dimly aware of my own pulse, but not ruled by it. That surprised me. The old me would have been pleading by then, asking questions in a way that invited soothing, giving everyone room to translate harm into misunderstanding. Something in me had gone past that. I reached into my robe pocket and took out the folded email. Andrea saw it and her face changed. Not dramatically. No collapse yet. Only a draining of warmth, a tightening around the mouth that made her look for the first time in all the years I had known her less like a capable woman managing a holiday, and more like a person caught at the edge of a thing she had believed would remain administrative forever. I laid the paper beside my plate. This was folded under the quilt with her lamp and pillow. I said, you wrote it to Eric 3 weeks after the funeral. Eric had gone gray around the mouth. Dad, please no. Not please. I looked at him. Not tonight. Andrea kept her voice low and steady, as if she were already working to give the scene a tone she could later describe to others. You went through private things. I went through my own house. That is not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing, I said. In my house? Silence. Then very small beside Claire, Lucy said, Am I in trouble? That broke something in me, not resolve, not focus, but a softer thing. I turned to her. No, sweetheart. You're not in trouble at all. Then why is everyone acting weird? Because the truth, I thought, makes children pay for adult vanity even when no one raises a hand. Instead, I said, because adults sometimes make a mess and then tell themselves it's tidier than it is. She considered that. It was too close to understanding for my comfort. Can I eat? She asked. Yes, I said. And because children will sometimes accept the shape of disaster if supper continues? She did. So we ate. Not in peace. not in anything I would call normal. But we ate. That mattered. It gave the room time to understand that I was not making a scene out of sudden grief, not collapsing into a widower's holiday breakdown, not about to be guided upstairs or gently sat down with tea. I carved the turkey. I passed the bowl. I told Ben to take more gravy. I asked Owen if he wanted the dark meat he always insisted he disliked and then stole from other plates. I moved through the rituals of the meal with a steadiness so complete that every person at that table had to face the one explanation they preferred least, that I knew exactly what I was doing. Andrea barely ate. She touched her fork to the cranberries once and arranged the green beans on her plate into parallel lines. Eric drank more wine than usual, and too quickly. Claire kept glancing at me as if trying to decide whether to intervene or defend or simply remain still enough not to worsen whatever was coming. Ben, to his credit, did what decent sons-in-law do in houses, not fully theirs. He made himself useful without pretending neutrality meant ignorance. He kept the children occupied in conversation. He asked Lucy about her paint set. He asked Owen about the truck. When no one else had the nerve to fill the water glasses, he did it. After pie, when the plates had been cleared and the children's energy had gone from bright to glassy, I stood. Ben, I said, would you take Lucy and Owen into the den for a little while? Owen looked at me at once. Lucy opened her mouth to object. Cards, Ben said with a calmness I respected more than I would ever tell him. I can probably lose a hand of rummy to both of you. Lucy slid down from her chair. Can we have the peppermint bark, if Grandpa says yes? Yes, I said. Owen stayed seated. His eyes, solemn and dark, moved from my face to Andrea's and back again. Owen, I said gently, go with Ben. He hesitated. Then he stood and obeyed. As they crossed the threshold into the den, I caught Andrea watching the boy. Not lovingly. Assessing whether he had absorbed too much would say too much understood too much. It was the look of a person who thinks in terms of spill and containment. Claire began stacking plates. Leave them, I said. She looked up. I had not used that tone with her in years. She sat down again. I remained standing at the head of the table. The chandelier light fell straight down, flattening everything. The silver, the candles, the half-empty wine glasses, the folded napkins. A holiday table after dinner is always a little indecent-looking, I think, evidence of appetite and fatigue and whatever people could not swallow with the food. Tonight it looked like a courtroom, furnished by memory. Here is what will happen, I said. No one is leaving until I'm finished. No one is going to tell me this is timing or grief or misunderstanding. We are going to walk through what happened to Evelyn in this house and what was done to her after she died and what you planned to do with me once the story had settled. Eric covered his mouth with his hand. Andrea spoke first. That is a grotesque overstatement. It is exact. No, it's emotional. Yes, I said, it is. That does not make it inaccurate. I picked up the green carafe from the sideboard. This is Evelyn's, the real one. Not the smooth glass somebody put upstairs to look like memory. This one sat by her bed when she was sleeping downstairs. Lydia Bell remembers the room clearly. She remembers the intake setup clearly. She remembers because your mother called it mission control. I looked at Eric. Does that sound like news to you? My son stared at the tablecloth. Eric. He swallowed. No. It was barely audible. Claire inhaled sharply. Ben in the doorway to the den did not move. I turned to Andrea. And this. I unfolded the email and laid it flat beside the dessert forks. This is you, in writing. Need to keep Tom settled upstairs with the memory room story for now. Story, your word. Andrea did not reach for the paper, that I would later think was one of the most revealing things she did all evening. She had spent years controlling objects in this house, placing, moving, assigning, correcting. But she knew better than to touch the page now. She kept her hands folded. I wrote that in a moment when everyone was exhausted and raw, she said. You are reading strategy where there was only damage control. Damage control, I repeated. For whom? For the family. No, I said, for order. She lifted one shoulder slightly. Sometimes those are the same thing. And there, without fireworks, without ranting, without melodramatic confession, the mask finally opened. Not all at once. Not into madness or cruelty broad enough for the children to understand later. Something more believable and uglier. She did not think she had done evil. She thought she had curated damage into something livable. She thought the room downstairs looked too sick, too compromised, too small for the story she wanted the house to hold. She thought my grief needed shaping. She thought my future needed managing. She thought she was competent enough to decide. I looked at Claire. Did you know she wrote this? Claire shook her head slowly. Not that exact, no. But you knew the Blue Room story was false. Yes, and you let Owen be corrected when he said so. She closed her eyes. Yes, that hurt, but not the way Eric did. Claire's weakness had been the weakness of a daughter trying not to set one kind of grief against another, the old family habit of smoothing. Cowardly, yes, but not architected, not administrative. I turned to Eric. Stand up. He blinked at me. What? Stand up. He stood. When did you know Andrea was planning to move me out? He rubbed the back of his neck the way he had done since he was 14 and lying about homework. Dad, it wasn't like that. When? He looked at Andrea. That told me more than the answer would have. Look at me, I said. He did. After the first year, he said. Maybe a little after. We talked generally. Generally. About the stairs, about maintenance, about how alone you were here, using your mother's false room as part of the argument. His eyes dropped. It came up. I laughed once again. This time Claire flinched too. It came up, I said. That's beautiful. Did my wife's death come up generally too, Dad? No. Answer. He swallowed. Andrea thought. I am not asking what Andrea thought. It was then, I think, that the true fracture with my son took place. Not because I learned he had known. I knew that already. But because in the moment when he could have stepped out from under her language and named his own part plainly, he still reached for her as translation. That was the wound, not conspiracy. Dependency. Ben moved away from the den doorway then and came quietly into the dining room. Do you want me to keep the kids farther back? He asked. I looked toward the den. Through the cracked door, I could hear Lucy talking over a card game, could hear Owen not talking at all. Yes, I said. Ben nodded and shut the den door more firmly. When I turned back, Andrea was watching me with the cool concentration of someone recalculating how much softness remained useful. All right, she said. Since we're apparently abandoning proportion, let's have proportion. Evelyn was moved downstairs because it was safer. True. The room upstairs was used afterward because it was cleaner for receiving people. Also true. The children were told not to chatter about the back room because the details were upsetting and you... She looked directly at me. Were barely sleeping, barely eating, and incapable of handling one more ugly practical truth without turning it into penance. Also true. It was one of the cruelest things anyone has ever said to me because almost all of it held some shape of truth. That is how intimate people do their worst work. They do not invent your weakness. They lean on the part you already know. Do you hear yourself? Claire said. Andrea did not even look at her. I hear myself very clearly. I did too. She had mistaken diagnostic language for innocence. If she could describe my grief accurately enough, then what she did to it became justified management. That was the logic. Would you like to walk the house with me? I asked her. She blinked. Excuse me. The house. You arranged it. You can help name it. No answer. I picked up the carafe again. Come upstairs, Eric said. Dad, there's no need. There is every need. And because I was done asking permission from my own family, I turned and walked out of the dining room toward the staircase without checking who followed. They all did, even Ben after looking once toward the den. Claire said through the door that the children were to stay put and not come out unless she called. Lucy protested. Owen said nothing. The house listened. At the top of the stairs, I stopped outside the blue room. The landing light cast a flat yellow shine over the wallpaper. The old fourth tread below gave its familiar complaint under the last of their weight. All at once, I saw the whole hall as if from outside myself this old domestic corridor made into a route of reverence because reverence could be steered better than truth. I pushed the blue room door open. There it was, the scene I had allowed for 3 years. The bed neat, the shawl folded, the photograph on the dresser. The wrong glass gone now from the bedside because I had brought the real one downstairs and she had not had time to restage. The absence helped me. It made the room look what it was, not haunted, not sacred, just arranged. I went straight to the closet and slid the door wide. Towels in their stack, washcloth basket, extra pillows, crib mattress. I turned back to the others. This, I said, is what you all called your mother's room. Sacred enough to correct a child for naming the wrong place. Sacred enough that I was expected to lower my voice in the hall. Sacred enough that my grief about it could be entered on a piece of paper under memory room issue. And in the closet, I stepped aside guest towels. Claire put a hand to her mouth. Eric did not move. Andrea's face remained composed. We needed the storage. Of course you did, I said. That's the point. I went to the bedside table and opened the drawer. Rosary tissues, hotel pens, the old lip balm. None of this is hers. She did not need every object in death, Andrea said. No, I said. She needed the truth. Then I crossed to the window and lifted the sash that stood cracked open for dry heat. Evelyn could not tolerate this room by the last winter, I said. The heat dried her throat. She coughed at night. She came up here once to test it and went back down. I remember that now because memory has stopped being convenient. I shut the window. No more of this room, I said, and I think in that moment the blue room actually changed. Not magically, not theatrically, but the false charge went out of it. It became again what it had been before we made it carry a lie, a guest room with wallpaper and winter light. I turned and looked at my son. Bring the shawl. Eric stared. Bring it, I said. He obeyed. He lifted the folded grey shawl from the foot of the bed with the careful reluctance of a man touching evidence of his own failure. We went downstairs. No one spoke on the staircase. The house did, though. It gave us every old creak, every protest, every settlement of wood and pipe, as if it had been waiting years to hear the family move through it in the right order. Public rooms, first false room, second, then the back hall, and what had been hidden by practicality and shame. In the dining room, I stopped only long enough to gather the papers from the sideboard drawer, the grocery slip, the side door note, the meal card. I placed them on the table. Then the email. Then the bell, which I had tucked into my pocket from the back hall cupboard before going upstairs. Small bright brass against the white linen runner. Claire saw it and covered her mouth. Owen found this in the linen basket once, I said. That is why he whispered to me in the hall. Because a child knew a bell from a room no one was supposed to name. Andrea's eyes flicked once involuntarily toward the den. You will not involve him further, she said. The nerve of it nearly took my breath away. Not guilt. Regulation. Even now, her instinct was to define the perimeter of acceptable truth. I won't need to, I said. I picked up the bell and the papers and led them into the back hall. The sewing room door stood shut. The old cream paint on the trim had chipped near the knob, where grandchildren's toy trucks and laundry baskets had clipped it over the years. I put my hand on the knob and paused. This, more than the dining room, more than the stairs, more than the call with Lydia Bell, was the point at which I understood what it meant to stop preserving unity. Opening that door in front of them was not simply proof. It was refusal. Refusal to let my wife remain translated into something neater. Refusal to let my children shelter inside the idea that intentions had cancelled outcomes. I opened the door. The room beyond was lit only by the small lamp I had turned on earlier, the brass one from the side table, not the one from the box. The yellow shade gave off a modest, practical pool of light. The daybed stood along the wall under the windows. The work table sat empty. The closet door remained slightly ajar. With people crowded in the doorway behind me, the room looked even smaller than it had alone. That I understood at once was part of what they had all recoiled from, the scale of it, the ordinary, unimpressive honesty of it. "This is where your mother died," I said. Nobody answered. This is the room she chose when the stairs became too much. This is where the tea tray came. This is the room the church women were told to use by the side door. This is the room Lydia Bell remembers because she adjusted the intake around it. This is the room Marisol changed the sheets in. At the sound of her name, Marisol appeared at the laundry room threshold. I had not heard her come in from the drive or the kitchen. She stood there with her arms folded tight across herself, still in her cardigan, eyes wide and tired, and for the first time since I had started asking questions, a little less afraid. "Marisol," I said, and turned to look at her fully. "Tell them where you changed Mrs. Mercer's sheets." No one in the hall moved. Marisol looked at Andrea first, then at me, then at the room itself. "Here," she said. It was nearly a whisper. "Say it clearly." She inhaled. "Here. In this room. Every Tuesday, sometimes more if she had a bad night. There are sentences that arrive with no ornament and still alter everything in range of hearing. That was one." Claire sat down suddenly on the straight-backed chair by the door because her knees had given under her. Eric put a hand on the wall as if steadying himself against motion that was not physical. Andrea remained upright. I did what I was told after Marisol said, voice shaking now but gathering force from accuracy. "The bell. The pillow. The tray." Mrs. Andrea said to pack them away. She said company would come and it looked too sick. Andrea turned on her then, not loudly, not with fury, but with a quietness so sharp it drew blood. "That was not what I said." Marisol flinched. "It is exactly what you said," I answered for her. "No," Andrea said, finally losing the polished domestic cadence she wore like jewelry. "What I said was that this room looked like suffering, and that suffering was all anyone would remember if we left it that way. Your wife hated being pitied. She hated mess. She hated becoming a spectacle. I refused to turn this house into a shrine to decline. There it was at last, not confession in the vulgar sense, revelation of creed. You refused. I said to let her final life remain small and true. I refused to let it remain humiliating." The word rang in the room. Humiliating. For Evelyn, perhaps in Andrea's mind, but beneath that for herself, for the household she wanted to manage, for the aesthetic of care she preferred. A dying woman in the sewing room by the side door and back hall did not fit her sense of what this family should look like under strain. Claire looked up at her. "You moved her into a prettier death." Andrea swung toward her. "I gave your father something bearable." "No," I said. "You gave me something useful." Silence again. I stepped into the room and set the bell on the daybed, then the papers beside it, then the email. When I spoke next, my voice surprised even me. It held none of the heat I had expected, only grief finally made exact. Evelyn was not humiliated here, I said. She was tired here. She was smaller here than she should have had to be. She was ill here, but she was still in her house. She could hear the kettle. She could see the garden. She could ring for me without shouting through the stairs. She was not humiliated until the rest of you decided this room was unfit for the story. Eric made a sound then, not a word, just the first fracture of one. I looked at him. "Say it," I said. He shook his head once. A child's movement in a grown man's body. "Say it. I let it happen," he said. There it was. Not enough, but true. Why? His face folded in on itself. Because she was right that it looked awful, he said. And then, as if hearing himself corrected, no. Because I didn't want to fight. Because Mom was dead, and you were walking around the house like if anyone touched the wrong lamp, you'd split in half, and Andrea knew what to do and I didn't. And once the room upstairs was set and people came and called it gentle and peaceful and beautiful, I let that become easier than this. He looked around the sewing room as he said this, taking it in with the helpless disgust of a son who had once loved his mother enough to hate what illness made visible and then hated himself for hating it. That room upstairs wasn't beautiful, Claire said quietly. It was easier. Eric covered his face. Ben, standing in the back hall, said nothing at all. I would remember that gratefully. There are some humiliations a man must be allowed to suffer without commentary from those not born into them. Andrea remained where she was, hands at her sides now, no longer folded, no longer hostess, no longer pretending the evening might still be redirected with enough tone. Her mask had not collapsed into screaming. It had collapsed into naked certainty. She believed she had been right, and that certainty was in some ways worse than remorse. We needed a plan for you too, she said to me after a moment, whether anyone here wants to admit it or not. So there it was, brought out cleanly. Because I'm old. Because you were unraveling. I was grieving. You were living in a mausoleum. The words hit the walls and hung there. Claire stood up. Jesus, Andrea. No, Andrea said, turning toward her with sudden ferocity contained only by volume. No, not Jesus. Facts. This house was becoming unlivable. He was sleeping downstairs half the time, forgetting to eat, letting rooms go cold, keeping everything exactly as it was because changing one pillow felt like betrayal. He was not managing. Someone had to think beyond sentiment. Beyond sentiment, I repeated. Is that what you call my wife? I call your wife dead, she said. And for the first time all evening, the room truly recoiled from her. Even she seemed to know it because her next breath came slower. And I call you alive? Or at least I was trying to keep you that way. The sentence should have sounded defensible. That was her gift. But what it exposed now was something simpler and uglier. She believed life was whatever remained once inconvenient truths had been cleared out of the way. I looked at the email on the daybed. Read it, I said. She did not move. Read your own words. No. Then I will. I picked it up and read aloud every line. Need to keep Tom settled upstairs with the memory room story for now. If he starts reopening downstairs or asking Marisol to pull things back out, it will undo all the progress. We can revisit cottages after New Year when he's less raw. Framing it around fewer stairs / less maintenance / preserving routines is still the kindest way. No one spoke while I read. No one needed to. The paper spoke well enough. When I was finished, I folded it once and slipped it back into my pocket. That, I said, is the moment you stopped helping. Andrea lifted her chin. That is the moment I started planning for reality. No, I said, that is the moment you decided my wife's memory was yours to edit and my future was yours to schedule. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue one last time, perhaps to define kind reality, progress, any of the words she had spent years turning into instruments. I did not let her. You will leave this house tomorrow morning, I said. Eric looked up in shock. Dad, you may come back another time if and when I ask you to. Not before. Not after private explanations, not after Claire calls on your behalf, not after some calmer week in January when everyone wants to remember only that Christmas got difficult. Tomorrow morning. Andrea stared at me. I live here, she said. No, I said. You manage here. That is over. You can't mean to do this on a holiday. I mean to do it before there is one more day in which you think the calendar excuses what you did. Eric stepped forward at last. Dad, please. Owen. Owen, I said, is already living in a house where adults teach him to fear plain truth. That ends now, too. He flinched as if struck. I drew a breath and felt beneath the pain and the fury and the nausea of what had been said in this small room something steadier, rising. Not victory. Authority, perhaps. Or perhaps only the relief of finally standing where my life had actually happened, instead of where it had been rearranged to look better from the hall. I turned to Marisol. "You will not lose your job." Her eyes filled at once. "Mr. Mercer." "You won't," I said, "if you'll still have it." She pressed her lips together and nodded once. Then I looked at Claire. "Would you take the children upstairs? Keep them out of this room." Claire crossed the hall at once. As she passed Andrea, neither woman looked at the other. That was its own judgment. A minute later, we heard Lucy protesting and Ben soothing and Owen's small voice asking a question too low to catch. Then footsteps overhead, then quiet. That left the four of us in the back hall in sewing room, me, my son, his wife, and the ghost of the life they had all tried to prettify. Eric finally sat down on the edge of the daybed as if the room itself had demanded it. He looked around at the papers, the bell, the lamp shadow on the wall, and something in his face aged 10 years. "I hated this room," he said softly. I did not answer at once. "I know," I said. He looked at me in raw surprise, as though he had expected condemnation and was unprepared for recognition. "I hated it too," I said. "Sometimes. Not because of your mother, because it told the truth faster than I could bear it." He bent forward and put both hands over his face. His shoulders shook once, then steadied. I had not seen my son cry since his wedding day, and that had been brief and drunk and proud. This was neither. She asked me for the lamp he set into his hands. "Do you remember the brass one?" "Yes." "I said I'd bring it down after work. I forgot. Andrea did it." I remembered. God help me, I remembered. Evelyn had said in that dry way of hers that the little lamp by the sewing room bed made her feel as though she were reading in a train compartment. Eric had promised to bring down the better one from the upstairs guest room because the pull chain was easier on her wrist. He had not. I had brought it 2 days later and thought nothing of the delay. "She waited," he said. "That's what I keep thinking, not for long. Just 1 day, but she waited and I forgot because I didn't want to come downstairs and see." He broke off. See what he looked up? Eyes red. How small it all got. That was true enough to matter. I let it stand. Andrea, however, had not sat. She remained in the hall, one shoulder against the wall now, as if even in defeat she refused the room its right scale over her. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quieter than before, and somehow more frightening. "If you think any of this means you can stay here alone forever, out of principle," she said, "you are proving my point." I turned toward her. Even now, even after the room, the carafe, the bell, the email, my son's admission, even now she believed the deepest issue was my management. "This is not about forever," I said. "This is about tonight. You are making tonight serve your pride." "No, I am making tonight serve my wife." At that, finally, something broke cleanly. Not in her body, in the story she had told herself about herself, for a flash only but unmistakable. The righteous manager, who had preserved order, gave way to a woman furious that her labor would not be recognized as virtue. "I am the only one in this family who ever did what needed doing," she said. And there it was, not shouted, not wild, but flat and bitter. The rest of you drowned in feelings and nostalgia and casseroles and church ladies, while someone had to make this house function. Someone had to decide where people slept, what children saw, how visitors moved through the rooms, what could be born and what could not. Evelyn knew that. Eric knew that. Claire knew that. You just liked not knowing. The words settled on us like dust. Because some of it was true. That was why the justice, if it was to mean anything, could not be built on pretending she had invented the weakness around her. She had exploited what was offered. She had turned fear and avoidance and practical exhaustion into permission. The room held all of that at once, and I knew if I answered her only with outrage, I would be lying too. "Yes," I said. She looked almost startled. "Yes," I said again. I liked not knowing. Eric liked not seeing. Claire liked not making things worse. And you liked being right enough to call control kindness. All of that is true, but only one of us turned my wife into a room that photographed better. Andrea said nothing. "That is the difference," I said. "Weakness is not innocence, but it is not authorship either." The silence after that was the first honest one of the night. At last, I picked up the grey shawl from where Eric had brought it downstairs from the blue room and folded it once over my arm. "This belonged here," I said, and laid it across the foot of the daybed. Then I took the brass bell and placed it on the little table by the bed. Then I picked up the green carafe. Not yet, I thought. Not before the room had air enough. I turned to Eric. "Tomorrow morning you can help carry their bags to the car. After that, you and I will decide whether we know how to speak to each other without her translating." He nodded once, brokenly. I turned to Andrea. "Take nothing from this room." Her jaw tightened. "I never wanted anything from this room. That I said is the problem. I left them there." Then my son, sitting bent on the edge of the bed. His wife standing in the hall, stripped finally of domestic sainthood, the papers on the coverlet like the small, plain evidence of what family can do when it confuses beauty with mercy. I went into the kitchen. The sink was still full of dishes from dinner. The tea towel I had used earlier lay damp by the faucet. On the counter, the coffee urn reflected the under-cabinet light in a soft nickel blur. The ordinary labor of the room looked almost holy to me then because none of it pretended. Grease was grease. Glass was glass. Dirty plates said we have eaten. A kettle said water will boil if you ask it to. No arrangement could persuade them otherwise. Claire came in a minute later, shutting the den door behind her. "The kids are in pajamas," she said. "Ben's reading to them." I nodded. She stood by the island arms, folded face blotched from crying. She had refused herself until she was out of sight of the others. "I should have told you," she said. "Yes, I know." I rinsed my hands, though there was nothing on them. I kept thinking, she said after a moment, that if we all just got through the worst of it, the details wouldn't matter. Then the details became the shape of it, and I still didn't say anything because by then it felt like saying it would only hurt you more. "That is how lies survive in families," I said. "They let decent people imagine timing is morality." Claire laughed through her tears in the small, miserable way Evelyn used to when she was caught fairly. "That sounds like Mom." "It does." We both stood in that for a while. At last, Claire said, "What happens now?" "Tomorrow they leave, and after that I looked toward the back hall. After that, I said, this house learns its own name again." She nodded. Later, after the children were asleep and Ben had carried the last suitcase from the upstairs hall down to the front entry without being asked, Eric came into the kitchen. He looked as if he had been peeled. Grief does that to men sometimes, but so does moral exposure. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't say that because the room is quiet." He flinched. "I mean it. I know you mean it tonight." He opened his mouth and closed it again. Then, with more effort, I let her make things easier, until easier became the only thing I could recognize. There was more truth in that than he had spoken all evening. I respected it enough not to spare him. "You let your mother disappear into good taste," I said. He bowed his head. "I know." "No," I said. "You know it now. That is different." He nodded. Tears starting again. Not dramatic now, just exhausted. I looked at my son and felt the strange divided pain of fatherhood in old age, wanting to punish, wanting to comfort, knowing neither would repair what had been revealed. In the end, I did neither. Some men would call that coldness. I think it was respect. He was no longer a boy in my kitchen asking forgiveness for a broken window. He was a man who had participated in making his mother's truth more bearable for himself and less true for everyone else. Comfort would have been another translation. "You leave in the morning," I said. He nodded. When he was gone, I stood alone at the sink and washed the dessert plates one by one, though no one had asked me to. The house quieted in stages, first the children overhead, then the low murmur of Claire and Ben in the guest room, then the front hall as Eric carried the packed bags down one trip at a time. Then much later, even the small sounds of Andrea moving about the master bedroom ceased. Through it all, the radiators hissed and clicked old iron doing the work it had always done. Near midnight, snow began again soft enough that I could not hear it fall, but could see it gather white against the black windows over the sink. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I carried the green carafe into the sewing room. The room smelled different now that the door had been open all evening. Less shut, more like old cotton and warmed wood and the faint ghost of the lavender water Evelyn used in her linen drawer. I set the carafe on the small table by the daybed and stood looking at it in the low lamplight. Then I went back to the laundry room for the lamp. It still sat in the box beneath the folded quilt, wrapped in newspaper. I brought it into the sewing room, set it on the table, and plugged it in. When I pulled the repaired chain, the bulb came on at once, warm and modest and entirely sufficient. That was what undid me. Not the confrontation, not the email, not Andrea's bare creed of order. The lamp. Because I remembered with perfect clarity the night I finally carried it down for Evelyn, 2 days after Eric had forgotten. She had been half asleep against the pillows and opened one eye when the better light fell across her book. There I had said, "Mission accomplished." She smiled without lifting her head. "You say that as though the mission had no casualties. What casualties? Your son's memory, your daughter-in-law's sense of efficient timing, the upstairs room's dignity." I sat on the edge of the bed then and said, "You can come back upstairs whenever you want." "And Evelyn dry, even with fever under the skin," said Tom. "I am downstairs because I want the kettle, not because I've been sentenced." That was who she had been. Not tragic, not saintly, a woman still choosing the practical shape of her life inside the narrowing available options. We had all in different ways failed to honor that. But tonight, at least the room had begun to hold her properly again. I sat on the chair by the window and let myself cry there quietly and without any wish to be dignified about it. Some grief must be performed decently because children are sleeping overhead and the house has had enough of spectacle. This was not that sort. This was the private old humiliating kind that comes when truth does not restore what it clarifies. I cried because the room had been hers and then had not. Because my son had become a man who called his own cowardice ease. Because my daughter had mistaken delay for mercy. Because Andrea had been right about some of my weakness and monstrous about what she did with it. Because I had needed an outsider and a child to tell me the house I knew better than anyone had been teaching me the truth for years. At some point the tears stopped. Age gives even grief an economy eventually. I rose, turned off the lamp, and left the door open. Morning came pale and brittle. I was up before the others, before the furnace's first hard kick, before the sky had entirely made up its mind to be day. The house at that hour belonged to me in a way it had not for years, not because no one else was in it, but because no one else was yet awake enough to arrange it. I went first to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. Then I took the green carafe to the sink. The water ran cold over my hands and over the glass. Outside, the eastern edge of the sky had begun to gray behind the bare branches. The kitchen smelled of coffee grounds not yet brewed yesterday's butter and the faint, clean mineral of fresh water. I rinsed the carafe, dried the base carefully, and filled it 3/4 full the way Evelyn liked, because more than that felt heavy to lift at night. Then I carried it down the back hall to the sewing room. The room was dim and almost blue with dawn. I set the carafe on the table beside the lamp and turned the tumbler upside down over the mouth, the way she always had, to keep dust from the water, and because she said a glass waiting open looked lonely. Then I adjusted it once, so the bubble in the base caught the first line of winter light coming through the garden side windows. Behind me, floorboards whispered. I turned. Owen stood in the doorway in his red pajama shirt, hair flattened on one side from sleep, the hem caught in one fist. He looked not frightened this time, only solemn, as if he had wandered into church and found something there that made more sense than the adults. "Sorry," he whispered. "For what?" He shrugged. I got up. "That's all right." He looked at the room, at the carafe, at the bed, then back at me. "This was her room," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. He nodded, taking that in with the grave exactness children sometimes have when adults finally stop making them hold two maps at once. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kettle began to murmur faintly in the kitchen down the hall. Somewhere upstairs, a bed creaked under someone turning over for the last few minutes of reluctant morning sleep. The house was still a house. That mattered too. Owen came one step farther into the room and put his hand on the door frame. "Mom said not to say it," he said quietly. "I know." Was she lying? There are questions from children that deserve truth and questions that deserve timing. This was both. I thought of Andrea upstairs packing in the dim light before departure. I thought of Eric with his raw, ruined face. I thought of Claire listening for movement, waiting to see what shape the morning would take. I thought of Evelyn in this room, asking for better light and tea and not 1 ounce more pity than reality required. "Yes," I said at last. She was. Owen looked down at the floorboards, considering that as seriously as if he had been handed a tool and told to test its weight. Then he asked, "Are you mad?" I smiled, though it hurt a little. "At some people. Not me. Never you." He nodded again, satisfied by the clear edges of that. I crossed to the window and pulled the curtain tie a little looser so more dawn could enter. The light widened across the daybed, across the shawl folded at the foot, across the green glass. It found the carafe first, just as I had known it would, and the bubble in the base held it like a small trapped morning. Owen came and stood beside me without touching. Together we looked out at the winter garden. The bare rose canes, the boxwoods squared dark against the snow. The path to the side door where churchwomen had once carried casseroles and where I had not understood enough to meet them properly. The room was not healed. Houses do not heal. People barely do. What it was, finally was aligned. Sad in the right place, honest in the right scale. No longer beautiful for the wrong reasons. Behind us, from somewhere upstairs, a suitcase wheel struck the top stair and paused. I did not turn toward the sound. The house had heard enough of leaving and rearranging. For 1 quiet minute before the day resumed its ordinary labor of consequence, it held only what it ought to have held all along. A husband, a child, winter light, and the true glass of water waiting where it belonged.